When a bridge collapses, we always demand to know which structural support failed.
Right. Yeah. You want to find the exact point of failure.
Exactly. Like we send in investigators to find the sheared bolt or the stress fracture.
Yeah.
And we point to it and we say, that is why it fell. We expect a really clear, logical, structural cause for a disaster.
We need that cause and effect to make sense of the world.
Yeah. But when you step into the world of mass psychology, and especially the internet, that logic just completely vanishes. Like when a mother commits the ultimate unimaginable tragedy of murdering her own children, why did millions of people online immediately rush to rewrite the rules of reality just to absolve her of all blame?
It's a really heavy question. And the way a culture processes that kind of unimaginable horror, well, it actually tells you far more about the underlying structure of that culture than it does about the horror itself.
Wow. Right.
We are looking at this landscape of mass reaction that is incredibly revealing, if you know how to read the symptoms.
And reading those symptoms is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to the deep dive. The stack of source materials in front of us is, frankly, heavy, it's dense, and it's deeply unsettling.
Very unsettling.
We are unpacking this essay titled The Genesis of the Inversion, From the Duxbury Charnel Ground to Kali Enthroned. And right off the bat, we need to establish that we are taking a very unconventional approach to a highly publicized news story here.
Right.
We are not looking at this through a true crime lens, and we are not examining the legal proceedings. The source is providing a deeply metaphysical, archetypal analysis of how the public reacted to this specific event.
Yeah, the author is basically using this tragedy as a diagnostic tool.
Right.
The essay treats the public outcry as a lens to examine a much, much larger structural shift that's occurring in our collective psyche.
Now, before we go one sentence further, I really need to look you, the listener, right in the eye. The source text touches on an incredibly sensitive, devastating, and legally charged real-world event. And it is absolutely crucial to make clear that neither of us is taking a side. We are not endorsing any specific viewpoint on the real-world case. We are not diagnosing anyone, and we are certainly not casting moral judgment, at all.
No, not at all.
Our one and only mission in this deep dive is to impartially unpack the profound psychological and cosmological arguments that the author presents.
We're basically acting as translators today for a very complex piece of cultural analysis.
Yeah.
The essay pulls from, the collective unconscious, ancient archetypes, cross-cultural metaphysics, all to make an argument about modern society at large. And my role here is to really help synthesize what the author is actually arguing about the structure of our culture.
Perfect. So let's establish the baseline catalyst for this essay. The text centers on the Lindsey Clancy case in Duxbury, Massachusetts, where a mother tragically strangled her 3 young children.
Right.
But the author's focus, it's not the courtroom or the crime scene. The focus is the immediate, explosive public fallout. Specifically, the source highlights the reaction of what it terms online collective nodes.
Yeah.
That's a key term.
Right. These were massive groups of people on social media and parenting forums who essentially circled the wagons to completely absolve the act. The dominant public narrative immediately framed the perpetrator not as a responsible agent of catastrophic violence, but as a blameless vessel.
Yes.
A vessel who was victimized by postpartum pathology, over-medication, and systemic medical failure.
And the author argues that this specific reaction transcends just regular social commentary, right? Or a debate about healthcare reform. It is an archetypal symptom. The text proposes that this overwhelming urge to remove all individual agency represents a psychological refusal by the public, a refusal to hold chaotic instinct accountable to what they call a vertical standard of limit and law.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of a vertical standard, because we are staring at an unimaginable tragedy, and the internet responds by essentially rewriting the basic rules of human accountability.
Yeah.
The author calls this a metaphysical fault line. But how does the source elevate a polarized Twitter debate into something as tectonic as a fault line? Well, think of a literal tectonic plate, right? When a massive earthquake happens, the ground doesn't just shatter in random directions.
Oh, it follows a path.
Exactly. It splits along a pre-existing fault line, this structural weakness that has been under immense pressure for a very long time, invisible from the surface.
Wow.
So the public's immediate, overwhelming urge to strip the mother of agency and place all the blame onto external systems, that is the earthquake.
Oh, I see.
It reveals this deep, pre-existing fracture in how our modern society understands power and individual responsibility and order. Because culture doesn't fragment by accident, it breaks along precise lines of meaning.
Right. It's treating the disease, not just the symptom. Or wait, watching society treat a terrible symptom without acknowledging the disease.
Yes, exactly that.
So if that public reaction is the earthquake, what is the underlying structural disease causing the plate to break in the first place?
So the author describes this core failure as the abdication of the logos.
The logos. But the text also uses terms like Shakti and Shiva. I want to pause right here because the source is aggressively mixing Greek philosophy with Hindu cosmology just to describe an internet phenomenon.
It is, yeah.
Why is the author blending these incredibly dense cross-cultural frameworks?
Because the author is trying to point to a universal human architecture, something that transcends any one specific religion or culture. To explain the breakdown of society, the text describes what it calls an inversion of sovereignty.
Okay.
In what the author considers an intact, healthy cosmological structure, you have two opposing but fundamentally complementary forces.
Right.
First, there is dynamic power, which the text refers to using the Hindu concept of Shakti.
Shakti.
Yeah. This represents raw energy, creation, emotion, and just the untamed force of nature. But for this dynamic power to generate life rather than just pure chaos, it has to operate in a vital union with unmoving consciousness and limit.
And that concept of limit is what the author refers to interchangeably as Shiva, or the Greek concept of the logos.
Exactly. The logos is the organizing principle. It provides the boundaries, the structure, that vertical standard of law that tells the raw dynamic energy where it can and cannot go.
Okay, I think I'm following.
You can visualize the logos as a sturdy riverbank, and the dynamic energy is the rushing water. Without the riverbank, the water isn't a life-giving river, right?
It's just a devastating flood.
Exactly. It just washes everything away.
But the source argues that our current cultural moment exists in what it calls the late Kali Yuga, which is another Hindu concept, right?
Yeah.
An age of profound cyclical decline and darkness.
Yes.
And in this era, that organizing principle of the riverbank has been rendered completely passive. The text uses a really chilling phrase for this, a sterile sky, meaning the structural authority has become entirely unable to enforce boundaries upon the field of reality.
A sterile sky is a perfect encapsulation of the author's view of modern authority. It looks down on the world, but it has absolutely no power to act or judge or constrain. It is literally just an empty sky.
Let's bring this down to earth for a moment for you listening, because it's a massive concept.
Yeah, it is.
If this sterile sky can no longer enforce boundaries, how does that actually manifest for you and me on a daily basis? Like, before we even look at a massive tragedy, do we see this loss of a vertical limit in minor, everyday internet arguments?
Oh, we see it constantly. Without a vertical standard of limit, a shared, objective rule book of reality, every minor disagreement escalates into a systemic critique. If someone disagrees with you online, the modern impulse isn't to say, your argument is logically flawed. The impulse is to say, you are a symptom of a toxic, oppressive system.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because the objective standard is gone, right? Everything becomes entirely relative, subject to interpretation, and driven by this horizontal finger-pointing. The system just loses the authority to say, this behavior objectively crosses a line.
So the structural brakes are just gone. We are hurtling down a mountain. The engine of culture is revving with all this dynamic energy. But the mechanism that actually stops us from flying off the cliff has just abdicated its post.
And nature abhors a vacuum. If the organizing principle, the structural brake, fails, human nature doesn't just sit still in a state of suspended animation.
Right.
Something else inevitably rushes in to fill that void and take the driver's seat.
Which brings us to the next major phase of the author's argument. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to ask, if the logical boundary-setting principle is gone, what takes over?
Right.
The text calls this new regime the enthronement of effect.
Yeah. When the ordering principle becomes passive, pure emotional intensity rushes in to fill that structural void.
The motion becomes the law.
Exactly. The text points out that trauma narratives and short-horizon passions suddenly occupy the central seat of cultural judgment. Emotions no longer just inform our judgment, they take the throne and literally become the judgment.
The text argues that this specific enthronement allows the lower strata of human existence to bubble completely unchecked to the surface, and it refers to these lower strata as the talus.
Right, the talus. In Hindu cosmology, the palace represent the lower, darker, more chaotic, and instinctual realms of existence.
Okay.
When the sterile sky fails to maintain order, these lower realms rise up and just flood the cultural discourse.
I want to challenge this framing just a bit, though.
Yeah.
Because is the rising of these lower strata, these talas, is that strictly a negative thing?
Well,
Because we often talk about the importance of bringing our dark, messy human instincts out of the shadows to understand them, right? Does the text view this raw emotion as inherently evil?
no, the text doesn't view the raw emotion itself as evil, but rather it views its enthronement as catastrophic.
Oh, the enthronement.
Yes. In an intact system, the lower strata provide the raw, vital material for the human experience, but they're supposed to be integrated and elevated by that organizing principle.
Right, the logos.
Exactly. When the collective unconscious processes a tragedy in a healthy culture, it seeks redemption through integration. It tries to understand the horror by aspiring to a higher moral standard, processing the darkness while still maintaining the boundaries of reality.
But according to the source, that integration is absolutely not what happened here.
Yeah.
The text argues that instead of seeking a higher standard, the collective demands that the baseline of reality lower itself to accommodate the horror.
Yes. Instead of saying this catastrophic act is an aberration that violates our highest laws, the collective discourse essentially says we must change the laws of reality so that this act is no longer an aberration.
Wow.
We must accommodate the act by removing the concept of individual fault entirely.
This is where the author's argument becomes deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
And I really have to push back strongly here on behalf of the listener.
Please do.
Because when we talk about a cultural focus on trauma narratives, or centering our discourse on emotional intensity and systemic failure, modern society generally calls that progress.
We do.
We call it empathy. We view it as a cultural evolution, that we're finally acknowledging the realities of things like postpartum psychosis and systemic medical failures.
Right.
So how does the author differentiate between what most people would call healthy empathy and this highly dangerous enthronement of effect?
The distinction lies entirely in the psychic load required by that phrase you mentioned, demanding the baseline of reality lower itself.
Okay.
True empathy within a structured, healthy cosmology requires an immense amount of cognitive and moral strength. It recognizes the devastating pain of a situation while simultaneously maintaining the vertical standard of law.
So it holds both.
Yes. Healthy empathy says, I understand the unbearable, system-crushing suffering that led to this tragedy, and this act remains an absolute, unforgivable crossing of a boundary.
It holds two deeply competing, painful truths at the exact same time.
Exactly. It carries the weight of both truths. It requires the really high effort of integration. The enthronement of affect, however, is not empathy.
It's not.
No, it is an act of surrender. It is surrendering to the chaotic flood of the talus.
Yep.
It is the collective stripping away the agency of the individual entirely, because maintaining that boundary, holding those two conflicting truths, is simply too psychologically agonizing.
Oh, I see.
Empathy says, you are in profound pain, but you are still an agent. The enthronement of affect says, you are a purely blameless vessel, and therefore the horrific act you committed is not actually your fault, but the fault of your environment.
We literally rewrite the fundamental rules of existence so the horror doesn't hurt quite as much to look at.
Yes.
We flatten the complexity into a narrative of total victimhood, because holding the tension of a mother committing an evil act while also suffering profoundly is just, it's too heavy for the collective mind to bear.
And that leads directly to the question of motivation. Why is maintaining that boundary so agonizing? Why would the collective unconscious want to surrender and lower the baseline of reality in this specific way?
Which brings us to the final and honestly perhaps the most intense argument in the essay, the defense of the shadow.
Yes.
The author argues that the overwhelming impulse of these female nodes, the vast online communities of mothers and women fiercely defending Lindsey Clancy, is not actually about Lindsey Clancy at all.
No. The essay proposes a radical reinterpretation of this whole internet phenomenon. We all possess what Carl Jung and other psychoanalysts call a shadow, right?
Right.
The dark, repressed, unacknowledged, and potentially destructive parts of our own psyche. The author argues that for the public to look at an act of catastrophic filicide and admit, she did this, she was an agent, and she crossed an absolute threshold of destruction, that would force a terrifying psychological reckoning onto the observers themselves.
Let me offer an analogy here. It's like walking past a funhouse mirror at a carnival, and it suddenly warps your reflection into this terrifying monster.
Okay, yeah.
Instead of stopping and admitting that the monstrous reflection is fundamentally yours, that the potential for that ugliness exists inside you, it is far, far easier to just blame the glass. You yell that the mirror is defective, that the lighting is oppressive, and then you just smash the mirror. Because by blaming the environment, you never have to admit the monster is yours.
That captures the mechanics of psychological projection perfectly. The text argues that this is exactly what the collective ego is doing. If you admit her agency, you have to admit that the potential for ultimate destruction exists within the human heart.
Yeah.
And specifically within the maternal archetype itself.
And the maternal archetype is supposed to be the ultimate symbol of nurturing and creation and safety.
Exactly why the shadow is so heavily repressed there. To admit that violence can emanate from the very source of life is an agonizing realization. It would require every participating node in that online discourse to confront the unintegrated destructive potential within their own psyche.
Because if she is a human, and she is a mother, and she is fully capable of that, then what am I capable of?
Exactly. To avoid answering that question, the collective ego projects this massive deflection shield. Externalizing the blame, screaming that it was the doctors, it was the psychiatric drugs, it was the oppressive masculine environment. It's a desperate defense mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
It locks the terrifying reality of human destructive potential safely outside of ourselves. If it's a systemic failure, then the individual is safe from their own shadow.
And this hidden, paralyzing fear of the inner shadow is the actual engine driving everything we've talked about today.
Yes.
The refusal to hold chaotic instinct accountable isn't born out of modern progressive compassion, as so many commenters might claim. According to the author, it is a cowardly retreat. We lower the baseline of reality and blame the system, so we don't have to admit we all have monsters in the basement.
The moment the collective unconscious succeeds in framing the perpetrator as a purely blameless vessel, the shadow is successfully hidden once again. The sterile sky remains passive. The raw emotion of the talus is accommodated, and the true, chilling horror of individual chaotic agency is swept entirely under the rug of systemic blame.
This is an incredibly heavy framework, but, it provides a radical new toolkit for viewing modern online behavior. Let's trace the path we just walked, because we moved through some deeply challenging philosophical terrain here.
We really did.
We started with a tragic, highly publicized news story, but zoomed out to view the public's reaction as a metaphysical fault line. We looked at the abdication of the logos, the loss of our structural breaks, and the rise of that sterile sky.
Yeah.
We watched the enthronement of affect, where raw, unchecked emotion replaces the baseline of reality, demanding surrender rather than true empathy. And finally, we saw how the collective defense of the shadow forces society to obsessively blame systems rather than confront the terrifying reality of human destruction.
And grappling with sources like this, regardless of whether you agree with every cosmological point the author makes, is immensely valuable. It trains you to look past the surface-level arguments of a cultural debate. The next time you see a massive viral reaction, a collective, frenzied circling of the wagons around any highly charged event, you can ask yourself a totally different set of questions.
Right, like what's really going on here?
Are people actually analyzing the facts of this case, or are we just watching the collective unconscious desperately projecting a deflection shield to defend its own shadow?
It completely changes how you read a comment section. You stop seeing arguments about healthcare or politics, and you start seeing thousands of people fighting to keep their own reflections out of the mirror.
It's a whole new lens.
But it also leaves us with a lingering, pretty unsettling question for you to explore on your own, one that builds directly on the text's premise. The source argues that externalizing blame onto systems like doctors or drugs or the environment allows the collective ego to avoid an internal reckoning. But if our entire modern digital culture is increasingly built on finding external systems to blame for individual actions, what happens to our society when we eventually run out of systems to point the finger at? When that deflection shield finally fails and we are left in the rubble with nothing but that unintegrated shadow staring right back at us.
That is the exact moment the fault line finally gives way.
Something to mull over the next time you log on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Imagine a mother commits just an absolutely unthinkable crime. I mean, the tragic taking of her own children's lives.
Yeah, which is just horrifying.
Right, exactly. You would expect universal horror from the public, like a collective shudder. But instead, this massive, highly visible corner of the internet immediately mobilizes to to defend her.
It's wild. They start forming these elaborate theories, right?
Yes. They attack the legal prosecution, and they essentially build this, impenetrable fortress of rationalization around an act that really should, by all normal metrics, just shatter them completely.
It creates this fascinating, albeit, deeply unsettling social fracture because the facts of the tragedy suddenly become secondary.
Secondary to what, though?
To the cultural need to process the event through a very specific emotional filter. Like, people weren't just discussing a crime anymore. They were violently renegotiating the terms of human accountability, and they were doing it in real time.
Wow. Well, welcome to today's deep dive, everyone, because if you are listening to this and wondering how an internet true crime debate spirals into a conversation about the fundamental structure of reality, you are definitely in the right place.
You really are.
So our mission today for this deep dive is to unpack this highly theoretical, honestly intensely philosophical text titled Transition to the Metaphysical Model. And the author takes that exact scenario I just described, the real-world Lindsey Clancy case, and uses it as a lens.
Yeah, a lens to map out a massive cultural shift.
Exactly. And they do it by combining Eastern metaphysics, specifically Vajrayana Buddhism, with these really deep theories on gender polarity.
We are definitely wading into some incredibly deep waters here.
Yeah.
I mean, the author is taking a horrific domestic tragedy and treating it as like a macro-level symptom of a society that has just lost its anchoring. Right. It's provocative, it's dense, and it operates on a framework that completely ignores our usual political or sociological categories.
Which is exactly why I want to establish our ground rules for this deep dive right up front. For you, the listener, we are here to impartially map out this author's really unique arguments.
Just mapping them out.
Right. We are not endorsing them. And we certainly aren't taking sides in some partisan gender debate. So if you hear something that challenges your worldview today, just know our goal is simply to help you understand the complex logic the author has constructed.
Yeah, we're just unpacking the source material.
Exactly. So to start, the catalyst for this entire philosophical model is the Lindsey Clancy case. This is where a mother tragically took the lives of her 3 young children.
Yeah. And the author treats this case as a concrete, real-time proof of concept. But it is vital to understand that the text explicitly states this analysis is not primarily about the clinical details of postpartum psychosis.
Okay, I have to pause here, because if you're listening, you might be thinking exactly what I thought when I first opened the source text. I mean, isn't this just a severe documented medical crisis?
That's the immediate reaction, yeah.
Like, the psychiatric field has clear terminology for postpartum psychosis. It feels, I don't know, almost jarring to overlay ancient Eastern metaphysics onto a modern psychiatric emergency. Why not just analyze it through a medical or legal lens?
Well, the text argues that looking at it purely through a clinical or legal lens actually misses the forest for the trees. The author calls the public discourse surrounding this case a bifurcation blade.
A bifurcation blade, like it's splitting something.
Exactly. The crime itself is the catalyst, sure. But the bizarre, highly polarized online reaction, that's the blade cutting society into 2. It reveals this much deeper script playing out beneath the headlines.
Okay.
So the author analyzes the reaction because the reaction exposes what society currently demands, what it fears, and most importantly, what it absolutely refuses to accept.
Well, let's examine that refusal then, because the source focuses really heavily on this large cohort of women online who aggressively defended Clancy. And the author makes 2 key observations about this. The first one is this concept of circling the wagons against accountability.
Right. And it goes way deeper than just normal internet tribalism.
How so?
According to the author, the intensity of this online defense was a collective refusal of the very principle that a mother can be fully answerable for such an act. The text argues that for this specific cohort, accepting her guilt accepting that she possesses agency and therefore accountability, it feels existentially threatening to the current emotional order.
Existentially threatening? Wow. So it's almost like a psychological immune response.
That's exactly it.
Like the people posting these defenses, they couldn't afford to believe she was accountable. Because if she is, their own internal architecture regarding, victimhood and agency and societal failure, it all just collapses.
Yep. Any crack in that narrative isn't just a disagreement about a legal case. To them, it's a threat to their entire worldview.
Which naturally leads to the source's second major observation, right? The indirect accusation.
Yeah, the relocation of blame. Because if the mother is structurally incapable of being accountable in their eyes, the blame has to go somewhere else. It has to be relocated. So the online discourse rapidly shifted to implying the husband failed her, or the medical system failed her.
Which brings us to this really fascinating conclusion the source draws about modern gender dynamics. By repeatedly claiming the husband should have done more, or, should have prevented the catastrophe, the author argues society is treating the expectation of vertical responsibility as inherently male.
Yes. The text is incredibly explicit here. It states that when the system fails, the burden of that failure is still, fundamentally, assigned to the masculine.
Even today.
Even today. The woman is positioned purely as someone acted upon by biology, by institutions, by a partner. But the expectation to maintain order, to anticipate the collapse and prevent it, that is treated as a masculine duty.
Okay, think of it like a load-bearing wall in a house.
Yeah.
The source is basically arguing that society fundamentally expects masculine order to be that load-bearing wall.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Thanks. And if someone inside the house lights a match and the whole structure burns down, the public instantly blames the load-bearing wall for failing to hold the roof up, rather than blaming the person who actually started the fire. The wall is just expected to withstand absolutely anything.
It is. And the author suggests this reveals a massive contradiction in modern discourse. I mean, we might publicly claim to have dismantled traditional gender roles, right? But the moment a true catastrophe hits, the collective instinct immediately reverts to demanding that the masculine pole absorb the responsibility for the failure of order.
That is heavy. But, okay, the text doesn't just stop at modern sociology. To explain the underlying why of this shift in blame, the source forces us to zoom way, way out into what it calls the Enthroned metaphysics model.
Yes, the metaphysics models. This is where it gets really dense.
Yeah, and we need to carefully define our terms here for you guys listening, because the author uses Vajrayana frameworks to build this whole argument. So what exactly is Vajrayana?
So Vajrayana is a branch of Tantric Buddhism. And unlike more ascetic traditions that focus purely on, say, detachment or peace, Vajrayana often deals with harnessing intense, chaotic, and sometimes deeply destructive energies. It's highly technical. And the author uses this framework to describe what happens when the primordial feminine current becomes completely detached from the vertical axis.
And the vertical axis being that load-bearing wall, right? The structuring masculine order we just discussed.
Exactly.
So the model is basically asking, what happens when the raw energy of creation is completely unmoored from the struction of order?
Well, according to the text, when that detachment is complete, creation turns inward and devours its own offspring.
God, that's a brutal image.
It is. The energy becomes entirely cannibalistic, and the surrounding culture, rather than recoiling from it, celebrates this carnage as, quote, a tragedy without a perpetrator.
A tragedy without a perpetrator. Wow. That perfectly maps onto the online reaction we just dissected.
It really does.
The tragedy simply happened to the mother, like a weather event, like a hurricane. But wait, how did we get to this point of detachment in the first place? Because the source points to a surprisingly mundane historical catalyst for all this.
Yeah, post-war material abundance.
Right. And I struggled with this leap at first, I'm not going to lie. How does having well-stocked grocery stores and nice suburban housing lead to a metaphysical collapse?
I mean, it sounds crazy until you unpack it. The text argues that material abundance eroded the brutal selective pressures of survival.
Okay.
Because for most of human history, sheer physical survival provided this massive external structuring pressure. You didn't have time for delusion. It forced the mind to remain grounded in objective reality because, frankly, the penalty for delusion was death.
You starve, or something eats you.
Exactly. But when you remove that struggle entirely, the discursive mind, which is our continuous chattering internal monologue, it loses its external constraint. So it turns inward.
Okay. So without a physical threat environment to navigate, the mind essentially treats itself as the threat environment.
Yes.
It becomes like an autoimmune disease of the psyche.
That's a great way to put it. And the author actually uses this brilliant mythological metaphor to explain this mechanism. It's the demon Raktabija.
Raktabija. Okay, tell us about him.
So in the mythology, Raktabija has this unique boon. Every time a drop of his blood hits the earth, a clone of the demon springs up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it represents this unstoppable exponential replication. And the source likens our modern unconstrained neuroses to Raktabija. Because we lack the grounding pressure of survival, our anxieties and our psychic distortions just multiply endlessly. They feed on themselves.
It's like putting a microphone way too close to a speaker.
Yes. The feedback loop.
Right. Without acoustic foam to absorb the sound, which in this case is the pressure of survival, the noise just loops and shrieks until it completely blows out the system. So, okay, in this Vajrayana framework, what is the mechanism to actually stop this demon from replicating?
Well, that'll be raw Shukti.
Shukti.
Yeah. In this context, Shukti is the primordial active energy of the universe. When these stagnant neurotic forms multiply out of control, Shukti arises as the necessary solvent to consume them.
The solve.
Right. It is pure, chaotic, destructive transformation. It burns away the dead wood. But here's the catch. For that destructive dance to not annihilate absolutely everything in existence, it requires a counterweight.
An anchor.
Exactly. And the author identifies this anchor as Smashana Shiva, or the Wanderer. This represents the unmoving absolute bedrock. It's the silent structural awareness that holds the center completely still while the destructive dance of Shakti exhausts its own fuel.
Okay, let's just ground this heavy philosophy for a moment for the listener, because that is a lot.
It is a lot.
If Shakti is the raw, chaotic energy burning through the neuroses, and Shiva is the immovable bedrock, the source is basically diagnosing our current era as one where we have a massive excess of this destructive energy, but the bedrock is just entirely missing.
Spot on. We are experiencing the solvent without the container.
Yeah.
The vertical axis is ruptured. The text suggests that the masculine structuring principle has been so hollowed out or discredited that it can no longer act as the bedrock. And without that anchor, the destructive energy doesn't transform society into something better. It just spins out of control and devours the innocent.
Which brings us to how this ancient metaphysical concept manifests in the actual people posting on social media today.
Right, bringing it back to the timeline.
Because the source provides a Vajrayana-framed reading of the situation. It argues that women functioning as raw praja, which I guess we can translate here as a kind of pure, unfiltered, intuitive capacity.
Yeah, that's a good translation.
Okay, so women functioning as raw praja act as mirrors.
The concept of the mirror is so crucial here. Because a mirror doesn't generate the image, right? It just reflects a macro condition of the environment, or what the author calls the field.
The field.
Yeah. And the text argues that the feminine intuitively channels the overarching state of this field with much less filtering than the masculine does.
Okay, so if you are an incredibly sensitive mirror and the world you are reflecting has a ruptured axis like where the bedrock is gone and the destructive energy is just running wild, your reflection is going to be pure chaos.
Yes.
The tragedy isn't the mirror itself. The tragedy is what the mirror is forced to look at.
Exactly. The author points out that because the axis is ruptured, masculine order is experienced by these women not as a protective structure, but is either entirely absent or deeply oppressive.
Like there's no healthy middle ground.
None. There's no healthy living architecture to reality test their intuition.
And under those conditions, the text outlines the only survival strategies they have left. One is defensive bonding, seeking safety in numbers, forming mobs online.
Right.
Another is selecting chaotic, destructive masculine forms. And the third is exactly what we saw in the Clancy case, a collective refusal of accountability.
Because without a vertical reference to correct the reflection, the energy simply intensifies. The intuition just loops back on itself. The source describes this runaway energy seeking safety in something it calls the Southern egregore.
Okay, we should definitely define egregore for anyone who might be unfamiliar with the term.
Good call.
So in occult or esoteric traditions, an egregore is basically a non-physical entity that arises from the collective thoughts and intense emotions of a distinct group of people.
Right.
And once it's created, it takes on a life of its own and it demands to be fed.
Exactly. So the author is suggesting that this unanchored, defensive, emotional energy on the internet has essentially formed a self-sustaining psychic entity.
Yeah.
An egregore.
Wow.
Yeah. It feeds on outrage. It demands absolute conformity, and it violently attacks any attempt to introduce objective accountability. Because accountability is structural, and structure is perceived as a threat by the egregore.
See, I want to highlight a massive nuance here, because the author really goes out of their way to clarify this isn't some partisan internet turf war.
No, not at all.
This isn't a women are doing this, men are victims narrative. The text explicitly states this is a symptom of a systemic breakdown. The feminine is reflecting a broken world because there is no living masculine pole strong enough to meet it, hold it, and rectify it.
Right.
The horror of the real-world crime is absolute, obviously, but the bizarre social reaction is a symptom of this deep structural fracture in our reality.
It's a terrifying display of what a completely unrectified field produces. But, the author doesn't paint with a completely broad brush here.
No, they don't.
Because the text addresses a very obvious question. If the collective online response represents this chaotic field, how do we explain the women who look at that true crime discourse and find it completely insane?
Right, the ones who don't participate in the distortion, how does the model account for them?
Well, the text explains this through the concept of the animus polarity.
Okay, a little Jungian psychology thrown into the mix.
Exactly. So for those who don't know, the anima represents the inner feminine within men, and the animus represents the inner masculine, so the internal structures of logic, boundary, and order within women.
Okay.
The author argues that when this polarity is ruptured externally in society, it drastically affects how individuals process reality internally.
And the source really zeroes in on women with high intuition and low structural containment.
Yes. The low structural containment means they lack a strong internal animus and they are isolated from any external bedrock.
Right.
Because they lack that structure, they experience their subjective, emotional reading of the field as absolute truth. They feel a certain way, therefore that feeling must be objectively real. And then they organize to protect that subjective reality at all costs.
It sounds like being in a sailboat without a keel.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, think about it. You have this massive sail catching all the wind, which is the intuition, the emotional weather of the collective. But without the heavy lead weight at the bottom of the boat, the structure, the first strong gust of collective outrage, just capsizes the boat entirely.
Because there's nothing holding it upright.
Exactly.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. Without the keel to reality test the wind, the boat simply flips. But, the author draws a very sharp delineation here.
Right, because there's a different outcome for other women.
Yeah. The text argues that women who remain inside what it calls smaller, male-led, higher-order circles, they tend to stay much more reality-oriented.
And according to the mechanics of this model, why do those specific circles prevent the boat from capsizing?
Well, because in those smaller, localized circles, a living masculine pole still exists. The external bedrock is present.
It acts as the keel.
Exactly. It provides a localized vertical reference, a reality testing mechanism that meets the intuitive energy and grounds it before it can spiral into that collective delusion.
Which brings us to a detail in the text that I found, honestly, genuinely chilling. Because it introduces a technological accelerant to this ancient metaphysical problem.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
The author notes that it's not just about who you associate with physically, it's about the medium through which you exist. The source states that the more atomized and screen-mediated a person is, the more purely they channel this unrectified field.
That phrase, screen-mediated, it changes the entire scale of the problem.
Totally.
When you are sitting alone in a room, interacting with the world entirely through a glowing rectangle, you are stripped of all local physical structure. You are completely atomized.
You're just floating.
Exactly. And in the author's framework, removing all physical context makes you the perfect, unfiltered channel for the chaotic emotional weather of the internet.
The screen just removes the keel entirely.
It actively dissolves it. And the conclusion the source draws from this mechanism is incredibly stark. The author notes that the public outing of these extreme viewpoints, like the people defending the indefensible online, it's not an anomaly. It is simply the underlying pattern becoming visible at scale.
The fracture is just fully exposed now.
Yes, and the source takes a very detached, almost cold view of how to handle this. The author argues that there is absolutely no need to try and correct these extreme versions online.
Which goes against all our instincts, right?
Totally. But they say you don't need to dive into the comment sections and, quote, carry their karma. They are simply revealing what they are.
The text describes it as a sorting process, actually. The people who can still orient to structure, who still have a keel, they will remain reachable by reality.
Right.
But the ones who cannot, the ones fully captured by the screen-mediated egregore, they will just keep reflecting the chaos. And the author is stating that this sorting of populations is already actively underway right now, and it is largely based on an individual's relationship to structure.
It implies a cultural divide that is impossible to bridge with mere argument, because the two sides are operating under completely different metaphysical physics.
Absolutely. Well, let's pull all of this together for you. We started today with a horrific true crime story and a really bizarre internet reaction, and we followed the author's lead and zoomed out to discover a highly technical argument about how the loss of external survival pressures is causing our collective neuroses to basically multiply like a mythological demon.
Yeah, we saw how the source uses the Vajrayana concepts of raw Shakti, that destructive solvent, and the missing bedrock of Siva, to explain why our culture seems to be celebrating chaos, and why so many people instinctively shift the burden of failure onto a vanished masculine order.
It is a profound framework. I mean, it forces you to look past the immediate outrage of a headline or, the toxicity of a comment section and ask what structural collapse allowed that outrage to flourish in the first place.
Yeah, it asks the deeper question.
It does. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building specifically on that concept of screen-mediated reality.
Oh, the intersection of ancient metaphysics and modern algorithms.
Exactly. If the author is right, if atomized, screen-mediated individuals are purely channeling unanchored emotional chaos because they lack local structure, what happens as our entire civilization migrates further into the digital realm?
That is a terrifying thought.
Right. Because think about the fundamental architecture of the internet. Social media algorithms are not designed to act as a bedrock. They are not designed to reality test your intuition. They are literally engineered to amplify your emotional weather just to keep you scrolling.
They are monetizing the Raktabija demon.
Yes.
They reward the replicating neuroses rather than anchoring them.
So the terrifying question is this. Are our screens merely reflecting a ruptured axis, or are the algorithms actively preventing the vertical axis from ever being rebuilt?
Wow.
If we are permanently mediated by technology that optimizes for chaos and punishes structure, how do we ever find the bedrock again?
It suggests that the deeper we sink into the digital field, the harder it will be to find the keel.
It really does. It means we have to start paying very close attention to the structures we build in our own physical lives, far away from the glow of the phone. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the deeper scripts behind the headlines, fiercely guard your own reality testing mechanisms, and we will see you next time.
So imagine society is a high-performance car, like, a really powerful one.
Right.
Now imagine taking the raw, explosive power of that engine and just dropping it right into the driver's seat.
Oh, man, that sounds like a disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, you take the steering wheel and the brakes and you just lock them away in the trunk.
Because you just have all this momentum.
All the momentum, all the energy, but the fundamental mechanisms required to actually direct that energy or, stop it from careening off a cliff, they're completely gone.
They're just gone, yeah.
And today, we're looking at a framework that argues this isn't just a colorful metaphor. It is, according to the source we're looking at, an exact diagnosis of what has happened to modern civilization.
It really is a staggering way to view the world. I mean, it requires stepping completely outside of our usual analytical boxes.
Right, because normally we look at, inflation metrics or voting patterns to figure out what's wrong with society.
Yeah, exactly. But the author of today's text, which is an essay titled 3, on the Lindsey Clancy debacle, Kali Enthroned, they bypass all of that completely.
They go in a totally different direction.
They really do. They use ancient Hindu mythology as this structural diagnostic tool, to map out the psychological and cultural shifts of post-World War II society.
Which is wild. And, just to be clear for you listening, given the massive sweeping critique this text makes about modern culture, our goal today isn't to, take a political side or endorse this specific worldview.
Right. We're just analyzing the text.
Exactly. We are here to reverse engineer this fascinating intellectual architecture. Think of this deep dive like putting on a pair of night vision goggles.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, we're looking at the exact same modern world you see every day, but this author's framework highlights entirely different hidden energy currents.
Currents that dictate human behavior but are usually invisible to the naked eye.
Right. But to turn those goggles on, we really have to start with the text's core vocabulary, don't we?
We do. And the foundation of it all relies on two primal forces borrowed from Hindu philosophy. Though, it's important to note the author uses them to describe structural reality, not literal deities.
Okay, so they're using them as archetypes.
Exactly. So the first one is Siva. In this specific framework, Siva represents pure consciousness, the masculine principle, and most importantly, limit.
Limit.
Right. The text often refers to this as the logos. It's the ordering principle that gives shape to reality. I mean, it's the architectural force that says, here's a boundary, this goes here, that goes there.
So if you picture a raging river, the logos, the Siva principle, is the riverbank.
That's a great way to put it.
It's the structure that channels the energy so it actually flows somewhere purposeful instead of just, flooding the entire valley.
That captures the dynamic perfectly because the water itself, in that analogy, is the second force.
Which is Sukti.
Right, or more specifically in this text, raw Shakti. And this represents ungoverned power. It is the collective, unconscious, unbridled desire, just raw, limitless energy.
Just pure force.
Exactly. On its own, it has absolutely no direction, only intensity.
Which brings us to the central thesis of the essay.
Mm.
The author argues that we are currently living through an inversion of these two forces.
Yes, a period they refer to as the Kali Yuga.
Right, resulting in this condition they call Kali Enthroned.
Because the historical hierarchy has been completely flipped. Instead of the logos channeling and directing the energy, like the riverbank you mentioned,
Right.
Raw Shakti, that ungoverned desire, has been elevated to the highest seat of authority. It has literally been placed on the throne of Siva.
So going back to the car analogy, the engine is officially in the driver's seat.
The engine is driving the car.
But when a society structurally elevates unbridled energy like that and just, suppresses the concept of limits, the psychological fallout has to be massive.
Oh, it is.
According to the source, what actually happens to the architecture of everyday life when that steering wheel gets tossed in the trunk?
Well, the author uses incredibly visceral language to describe this collapse. When raw Shakti is no longer held in its proper relationship to the limiting principle, the lower, more chaotic strata of human existence just get unmoored.
The text has a specific name for these lower levels, right?
Yeah, it refers to these base levels as the talus.
Huh.
Without the logos to keep a lid on them, these chaotic impulses bubble to the surface, and I'm quoting here, like a backed-up septic tank.
Oh, wow, a backed-up septic tank. That is a deeply unsettling yet vivid image.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, the foundational chaos, the base impulses that a functional society usually manages or, keeps buried underground, are suddenly overflowing into the streets and our living rooms.
Exactly. And while that chaos is bubbling up from below, we also have to look what happens above, to the limiting principle itself.
The Siva principle.
Right. The text calls the displaced logos the sterile sky.
The sterile sky.
Because Siva has been dethroned, the realm of order loses both its authority and its instinct to act upon the world.
Which the text calls the field, right?
Yes, the field. So the masculine principle of structure is rendered entirely passive. It can observe all this chaos bubbling up, but it cannot, or maybe will not, intervene to establish boundaries.
But wait, if this logos was so critical to human survival for thousands of years, humanity wouldn't just abandon it by accident.
No, absolutely not.
Like something physical, something material in our history must have happened to break that cycle of consequence. The steering wheel didn't just fall off, Something convinced us we didn't need it anymore.
And the author traces that physical catalyst directly to the post-World War II era in the West.
Okay, so relatively recently.
Very recently in the grand scheme of things. This was the dawn of unprecedented material abundance. Suddenly, society entered what the text calls a near frictionless environment.
Frictionless meaning?
Meaning the daily life-or-death struggle against the natural elements was largely suspended.
Okay, so to really understand the psychology of that shift, we need to dive into this concept the author calls northern adaptation.
Yes, this is a crucial mechanism in the text. The author argues that future planning is inherently a northern adaptation.
Meaning it comes from cold climates.
Exactly. Consider populations that evolved in environments with brutal, unforgiving winters. Their entire culture, their psychology, their social structures, they all had to be oriented toward long-horizon order.
Because if they weren't, they'd die.
Right. They had to delay gratification, stockpile resources, and strictly enforce rules. If they didn't do those things, the winter would literally kill them.
So nature itself enforced the logos.
Yes. The environment demanded strict limits just to survive.
So if you didn't chop the wood in July, you froze to death in December.
That's the brutal reality of it.
The natural world punished a lack of structure with immediate extinction, which means the logos wasn't an option. It was a mandate.
But then post-war material abundance effectively turned off the winter.
Turned off the winter. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Central heating, industrialized agriculture, mass logistics, it created this frictionless interval where that immediate survival pressure vanished.
Right.
It became feasible to indulge almost any whim or preference without facing immediate destruction.
But wait, let's unpack this. I'll play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
For most people, a frictionless environment with high material abundance and, a lack of brutal survival pressure, that sounds like the ultimate human victory.
It does.
We want central heating. We want supermarkets where we don't have to hunt for our dinner. We've spent millennia trying to conquer the brutal elements.
Right.
So why does the author view this pseudo-golden age of materialism as a catastrophic trap?
Well, that is the central paradox of the essay. The author doesn't deny the comfort. They analyze what that comfort does to human nature over time.
Okay.
Because the environment no longer ruthlessly punished the absence of structure, society fundamentally changed its posture. Men adopted what the text calls an Epicurean posture.
Meaning a focus on pleasure.
Exactly, a worldview primarily focused on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
So because survival was largely guaranteed by the machinery of the modern world, the ultimate good shifted from staying alive to just being comfortable.
Yes. And the psychological mechanism here is that the logos, that vital ordering principle that requires sacrifice and delayed gratification, was watered down.
It lost its teeth.
Totally. It was no longer understood as the absolute prerequisite for existence. Instead, having strict boundaries and long-term structures was reinterpreted as just one preference among others.
Oh, I see. So chopping the wood went from being a life or death necessity to just like a lifestyle aesthetic.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I prefer to chop wood and build a cabin, but you prefer to sit inside and play video games.
Yeah.
And hey, thanks to the modern grid, neither of us will freeze.
That is exactly it. And that exact shift in perspective allows the inversion to take root.
The Kali enthroned.
Right. The text points out that in this frictionless interval, deep inherent differences in human capacity, form, and orientation were suddenly treated as mere social constructs.
Because there's no pressure to prove otherwise.
Exactly. When the material world isn't severely testing people's capacities, society can afford to pretend those differences aren't real. We could afford the illusion that all forms are equal because the world was just too comfortable to prove otherwise.
So the true reality of Logos was forgotten.
Forgotten entirely, which allowed raw sekti to be enthroned with virtually no internal resistance.
So we have the mythic inversion, Kali enthroned, caused by material comfort, this frictionless environment. But we need to look at the symptoms. If the environment fundamentally changed our psychology by removing the friction, then the metrics for success in our society must have drastically shifted as well.
They absolutely have.
Because the old metrics were about survival and long-term building. What does a society governed by Kali enthroned actually select for today?
The text lays this out very clearly. Because the sterile sky can no longer master the chaotic forces at play, true mastery is essentially gone from the culture.
Gone completely.
Pretty much. What we have left in its place are the mechanisms of a bureaucracy. The author calls it management, optimization, and discourse.
So it's like obsessing over the UI design and the color palette of an app, completely blind to the fact that the back-end servers are literally on fire.
Yes.
Like the aesthetic field is perfectly optimized, the discourse about the fonts is very active, but the actual structural integrity is collapsing, and nobody knows how to fix the servers.
That is a perfect analogy for the symptoms the author describes. Because we cannot master the ungoverned power, selection follows the newly dominant current.
The raw skakti.
Right. And the text states that society now specifically favors and rewards, and this is a quote, intensity, trauma bonding, aesthetic shock, and short horizon passion.
Let's unpack those terms because they feel incredibly relevant to how the digital world operates right now. Aesthetic shock and trauma bonding.
It's everywhere.
It's not about what is structurally sound or true in the long run. It's about what produces the most intense, immediate emotional spike.
It is the ultimate manifestation of raw sekti. Without the logos to demand long-term value, the algorithm of society prioritizes whatever generates the most friction in the moment.
The cultural focus just shrinks down to the immediate present.
Exactly.
And the cost of this hyper-focus on the immediate present is what? Exactly. Like, what are we losing?
Well, the author points out that all of this comes at the direct expense of what they call the slower, costlier virtues of stability and intergenerational continuity.
Intergenerational continuity. Building things for our kids.
Right. Building something that lasts multiple generations requires immense sacrifice, boredom, and adherence to strict limits. It requires the logos.
And a society addicted to intensity can't handle that.
Not at all. A society addicted to intensity and aesthetic shock cannot tolerate the slow, costly virtues. They are too boring. They just don't generate enough immediate passion.
It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but doing it purely based on which arrangement gets the most immediate emotional reaction on social media.
Right.
Like, we are highly sensitive to the immediate emotional temperature of the room, but we've completely lost the capacity to look at the horizon and see the storm coming. We feel deeply, but we build poorly.
And the text explicitly warns about the ultimate logical conclusion to all of this. It says it's an inevitable betrayal.
A betrayal.
Yeah. A society operating under this inversion will suffer, quoting again here, growing inability to reproduce the conditions that created its own prosperity.
An inability to reproduce the conditions that created its own prosperity. That is the core warning of the text, isn't it?
It really is.
The success of the structure created the comfort, but the comfort destroyed the understanding of the structure.
Exactly. The prosperity we enjoy was built by the logos. It was built by northern adaptation, future planning, and strict adherence to limits.
Right.
But because that prosperity created a fictionless environment, successive generations just forgot the importance of the logos. They enthroned ungoverned power because, well, it felt better.
It's easier. It's more passionate.
But now the society is losing the capacity to maintain the very machinery that keeps it comfortable.
Wow.
And the author emphasizes this isn't just like a moral failing of modern people. It is the mathematical, unavoidable outcome of forgetting why the limit existed in the first place. When you put the engine in the driver's seat, eventually you run out of road.
So, bringing this all together for you listening, why does a dense mythological analysis mapping Hindu archetypes onto post-war history actually matter to your daily life?
Right. What's the takeaway?
Well, because regardless of whether you fully agree with this author's grim diagnosis or, find it too fatalistic, this framework offers a profoundly useful vocabulary.
It really does.
It gives you a structural why behind the chaos. The next time you see the endless churn of cultural outrage or notice how institutions prioritize emotional intensity over long-term building.
Or just feel that creeping sense of societal short-sightedness.
Exactly. You aren't just looking at random noise. You are looking at a system that has fundamentally changed its selection metrics. You are watching a society that forgot the winter.
That's a chilling way to put it. The framework really forces us to confront a very uncomfortable possibility. That what we celebrate as continuous progress might actually just be the luxury of a frictionless environment.
An environment that is far more fragile and dependent on forgotten structures than we realize.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a deeply personal challenge to mull over.
Yeah, and the author makes a compelling case here that long horizon order-like, the capacity to build and sustain anything of real value, requires the friction of harsh survival pressures. It requires a mandate.
Right.
If that's true, it raises a fascinating question about how we live today. In our modern era of ultimate convenience, where almost every physical friction has been removed from our daily lives, do we have to start artificially manufacturing harsh winters?
Wow. Do we need to intentionally introduce purposeful hardships, like voluntary struggles and strict personal limits into our routines, just to keep our own internal logos alive?
It's a huge question.
Whether it's digital fasting, intense physical discipline, or just rejecting convenient comforts. Maybe we have to step out of the frictionless environment on purpose.
Just to prevent our own future planning muscles from completely atrophying.
Maybe we have to manufacture the cold just to remember where the steering wheel and the brakes are. Turning on those night vision goggles really shifts how you look at the ease of modern life.
It really does.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible currents around you, and we'll see you next time.
If you spend, even 5 minutes on the internet today, you will immediately see a world run almost entirely by outrage, impulse, and just pure chaotic energy.
Oh, absolutely. It's wild.
Right. It's like the collective steering wheel has completely popped off and we're all just accelerating into a ditch together.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate way to describe the vibe right now.
But what if I told you that an ancient cosmological framework actually predicted the exact algorithm of modern social media thousands of years ago?
I mean, it is a staggering realization when you first see it mapped out like that.
It really is.
We tend to think of our modern hyper-reactive society as this unique byproduct of our technology, but this philosophy views it as a structural inevitability.
And that is exactly what we are getting into on today's deep dive. We are looking at a single, honestly, incredibly dense excerpt from a philosophical text, and it's titled "For Greater Meaning of Kali Enthroned."
Yeah, it's a very specific, very intense section.
Totally. So our mission for you today is to decode this intense mythic image of Kali enthroned. We are going to figure out what it tells us about ancient cycles of time and, more importantly, how it maps directly onto the architecture of your own mind.
Right. And the broad civilizational shifts we're all living through.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. The text throws some heavy esoteric concepts at us right out of the gate.
It definitely doesn't hold back.
No, it doesn't. We are dealing with concepts like Shiva, Shakti, and the Yugas, but we are going to translate all of this into actionable, mind-expanding insights for you.
Well, the best way to approach this text is to basically view the mythology as a highly precise vocabulary. These aren't just, fairy tales.
Yeah, they're not just old stories.
Exactly. They're psychological and historical blueprints.
Right.
So to really grasp what Kali enthroned means, we have to look at the cosmic environment that actually produces this image.
The timeline itself.
Yeah, because this text operates on the cyclical Yuga timeline. It treats this descent into chaos not as an accident, but as a gravitational inevitability.
So let's explore the mechanics of that descent, because the text outlines the progressive loss of the Golden Age through 4 distinct phases, right? We have Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and finally the Kali Yuga.
Right, the 4 stages of the cycle.
So what actually happens as we move through those cycles? Because it's described as the progressive weakening of the vertical axis.
Yeah, and to understand the weakening, we first have to understand the axis itself. In this framework, the vertical axis is the ordering, limiting, and illuminating principle.
Which the text refers to as Shiva, right?
Yes, Shiva, or pure awareness. And it actually brilliantly draws a parallel to the Greek concept of logos.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the rational, structuring, clarifying principle of the cosmos. You can basically think of it as the capacity for clear, unshakable presence.
So it's the anchor.
Exactly. In this tradition, it is the masculine pole of consciousness. Its entire function is to provide the structure and the center of gravity that just, holds the universe together.
But the text suggests that maintaining that absolute pure awareness takes immense cosmic effort, right? Over vast stretches of time, entropy just sort of sets in.
That's unavoidable, yeah.
So in the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, that vertical axis is absolute and unbending. Wholeness is the default state.
Right. Everything is perfectly aligned.
But as you move into Treta Yuga, things lose a quarter of their strength. A slight wobble enters the system.
A very slight wobble, but it's there.
And then by Dvapara Yuga, we are in a state of duality, operating at essentially half strength. And by the time we hit the full Kali Yuga, this ordering principle, this logos, is so stretched thin and attenuated that it simply cannot perform its function anymore.
And its primary function is holding things in proper relationship to the dynamic power of the universe.
The energy side of things.
Exactly, which the text refers to as Shakti, the feminine pole of energy.
Yeah.
If Shiva is the pure, still awareness, Shakti is the motion, the emotion, the relentless, energetic current of life itself.
The juice.
Yeah, the juice. In a golden age, strong, clear awareness perfectly orients all that vibrant, dynamic energy. The structure contains the fire.
But in the Kali Yuga, the awareness degrades. It gets so weak, it just can't contain the fire anymore. The text actually says the energy basically rises up and enthrones itself.
It takes over.
Yeah. And the world becomes, and I love this phrase from the source material, it becomes horizontal, turbulent, and short horizon.
Let's dissect those 3 words because they perfectly diagnose a collapsed system.
Yeah.
Horizontal means the system lacks any vertical depth or transcendent perspective.
Right. There is literally no higher principle to look up to.
Exactly. Then turbulent happens because energy without an ordering principle is inherently chaotic. It just crashes into itself.
There's this noise.
Total noise. And short horizon describes the total loss of broad perspective. When pure awareness fails, everything becomes intensely reactive, focused entirely on the immediate, fleeting moment.
So think of a spinning top. When you first launch a top and it's spinning perfectly fast, there's this profound clarity to it. It stands totally vertical on the table.
Oh, that's a great visual.
Right. There's so much order that it creates an illusion of stillness, even though it's moving incredibly fast. That perfectly vertical state is Shiva, pure awareness holding dynamic energy perfectly in check.
Beautiful, yes.
But as friction wears it down over time, it loses its center. It starts to wobble, it gets erratic, and eventually its kinetic energy just scatters completely horizontally across the table.
And that's Shakti unbound.
Exactly. So is the image of Kali enthroned essentially the mythic signature of the top finally losing its vertical center?
What's fascinating here is the physics of your spinning top analogy perfectly illustrate the text's central argument. The state, Kali occupying the central seat, it is not a random glitch in the system.
It's just physics.
Right. When the top inevitably wobbles and falls as it loses its momentum, the kinetic energy doesn't disappear. It just acts without a center.
It has to go somewhere.
Exactly. When the masculine pole of consciousness can no longer contain and orient the feminine pole of energy, the energy naturally enthrones itself by default. The image of Kali on the throne is just the precise, predictable math of late Kali Yuga.
So if the vertical drops out, the horizontal automatically takes over. There's no vacuum. But if this happens on a cosmic scale to the universe, what is the mechanism inside our own heads?
Because it always maps back to the individual.
Right. The text insists that this macrocosmic cycle mirrors the microscopic reality of human psychology. So why does the vertical axis weaken in our own minds?
Well, the text explains this through the mechanics of descent. Consciousness descends by progressively identifying with more limited reactive layers of reality.
How does that look in practice?
Imagine pure, spacious awareness standing at the peak of a mountain. From up there, you see the entire landscape. But as you descend the mountain, your field of vision narrows.
You lose the big picture.
Exactly. You start identifying with smaller and smaller things.
Yeah.
First, you forget you are pure awareness, and you start identifying entirely with your thoughts.
Then you go lower, and your thoughts give way to transient emotions. So you aren't just thinking about a problem anymore. You are completely consumed by the anger or anxiety surrounding it.
Yes, you become the weather instead of observing it.
And the text argues that as you keep descending, you eventually hit the absolute bottom. And at this point, your awareness is so incredibly contracted, so completely caught up in tiny, immediate reactions, that you completely lose the capacity to be the unmoved witness.
You lose the mountaintop perspective entirely.
Yeah.
And when you lose the capacity to be the unmoved witness, the energetic, emotional, and instinctual currents, that Shakti energy we talked about, they appear as the absolute only living reality.
He says there's nothing else left.
Right. Because your awareness is too weak to step back and observe the emotion, the emotion itself simply takes the commanding position.
Okay, wait, I'm stuck on this. Here's where it gets really interesting, but also a bit counterintuitive.
Okay, lay it on me.
If we look at modern psychology, we are constantly told the exact opposite. We are told to trust our gut, to feel our feelings, to let our authentic emotions guide us.
That is the dominant narrative, yeah.
But the text says that at the bottom of the descent, our emotional and instinctual currents become our only reality, and that power is mistaken for the highest principle. So is this ancient text fundamentally arguing that modern therapy and our modern obsession with emotional validation are actually symptoms of a dark age?
That tension right there is the crux of this entire philosophical framework. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires us to look at the nuance of hierarchy. The text is very clear that the goal is not to suppress instincts or destroy the energy. Modern psychology often tells you to feel your feelings because it is trying to cure a state of unnatural numbness or repression.
Right. It wants you to thaw out the system and actually acknowledge the energy.
Exactly. But the text is describing something much more extreme than just acknowledging a feeling.
It's not just saying, oh, I feel sad right now.
Exactly the opposite of mere acknowledgement. It describes a state where the feeling becomes you. The energy completely overrides your capacity for objective awareness.
It sits on the throne.
Yes. When power and instinct are mistaken for the highest principle, you actually lose your freedom. You become a hostage to whatever energetic current is passing through you in that moment.
Wow.
You are no longer making choices. You are just a conduit for horizontal turbulence.
So if I'm furious about something I wrote online, in this fallen state, I am not a person experiencing the temporary weather pattern of anger. The anger is sitting on the throne in my mind, driving the car, and dictating my entire reality.
And the text states that the corresponding ascent, the way out of this contracted state, requires your consciousness to become strong enough to reclaim the throne.
How, though? Just by fighting it?
No, not by killing the anger, not by suppressing the Shakti, but by restoring the proper internal hierarchy. Power must serve awareness rather than replacing it.
That makes a lot of sense.
The container of your awareness basically has to be built big enough to hold the intense energy without being completely shattered by it.
Let's use a different analogy here to really lock in how this hierarchy works. Think of a nuclear reactor.
Oh, perfect.
The vertical axis, the pure awareness, is the control rods. The Shakti, the dynamic energy, is the radioactive uranium.
Right. Incredible power, but volatile.
Exactly. Without the control rods firmly in place, the raw radioactive energy melts down the entire facility. It destroys everything. But when those control rods of awareness are deeply and firmly inserted into the core, they regulate the immense heat, and suddenly that exact same dangerous energy is powering an entire city.
That perfectly bridges us to how this dynamic functions in authentic practice. The text moves into what it calls tantric alignment, essentially giving us a blueprint of a fully functional reactor.
The ideal state.
Yeah, in authentic tantric praxis, the ultimate goal is the union of Shiva and Shakti.
The union of the control rods and the uranium. Pure awareness meeting dynamic energy.
And the geometry of that union is totally uncompromising. The text explicitly states that awareness remains the seat and energy is fully awakened and integrated within it.
So the vertical axis is firmly planted, and the horizontal energy spins perfectly around it. The unmoved witness is holding the immense power without flinching.
Exactly. But the text points out that when a spiritual practice or an entire culture inverts this order, things break down in two very distinct ways. We basically get two different types of systemic failure.
Right, so the first one is what the text calls dry, sterile Shiva.
Yes. This is awareness completely devoid of power.
What does that look like in a person?
It is the person who is completely detached, overly intellectual, and totally unemotional. They have retreated to the mountaintop, but they have completely disconnected from the juice, the vitality, and the messiness of life.
The vertical axis is present, but there is zero energy spinning around it. The reactor is essentially just shut off.
Exactly. Then there is the second failure, which is the exact opposite. Wild, enthroned Shakti.
This is the meltdown.
This is the meltdown. It is power completely devoid of the limiting and illuminating seed of awareness. Pure, raw, unchecked energy just burning through the system.
And here's where the text makes its most profound civilizational diagnosis. It states that Kali Enthroned represents the second failure, but played out at a macro, global scale.
The source material describes this as a phase where the red pole, which is the dynamic, fiery, horizontal energy, has completely overwhelmed the white pole of cool, clear awareness.
The uranium melted the control rods.
Pretty much. It argues that during this phase, the lower centers and the collective unconscious actually dictate the tone of the entire field.
Let's unpack the field for a second. We are talking about the shared psychic and informational environment of a society, right?
Yes, our collective mental space.
So think about a viral outrage cycle on social media. It is the absolute perfect embodiment of the red pole overwhelming the white pole. I mean, how does an outrage cycle actually work mechanically?
It's certainly not rational.
Right. It strips away all nuance, context, and rational deliberation. It relies entirely on emotional contagion. It is raw, reactive, highly turbulent energy dictating the tone of the entire global field.
And when you analyze those digital outrage cycles, you find absolutely zero clear, discriminating vertical consciousness.
None at all.
The algorithms themselves are designed to be entirely horizontal and deeply short horizon. They prioritize engagement through anger, fear, and instinctual reaction.
Because that's what keeps people clicking.
Exactly. When power replaces presence as the highest principle in a society, the loudest, most emotionally dysregulated voice automatically wins, regardless of the truth or wisdom behind it.
We are literally seeing Kali enthroned in the code of our technology. It completely reframes the way you look at the daily news. You start to see the missing vertical axis behind, every headline.
Yeah. It's hard to unsee it once you recognize the pattern.
But the text doesn't just leave us with this terrifying diagnosis of a societal meltdown. It actually provides a highly specific and slightly counterintuitive corrective.
The nuance of the solution is really critical here. The text explicitly states that the corrective is not the destruction of Kali.
Which is our first instinct, right? When we see chaos, we just want to destroy it. We think we can banish the chaos by creating a sterile, tightly controlled, emotionless vacuum.
But doing so just pushes you right into the other failure state, that dry, sterile Shiva. You don't solve the problem of a chaotic society by completely disengaging, retreating into a cave, and shutting down your emotional life.
Right, that doesn't fix anything.
The text states the corrective is the restoration of the throne to its proper occupant. We must reestablish presence as the highest principle.
So the vertical seat has to be painstakingly rebuilt before the awakened energy can actually be integrated.
The ultimate goal is described as a full, non-dual embrace. That means holding the totality of the world's energy without rejecting any of it.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and that embrace is utterly impossible until your awareness is strong enough to hold the unbound energy without being shattered by it.
So if you try to fully integrate all the wild, turbulent energy of modern politics, media, and society without first strengthening your own internal presence, you will just simply be swept away by the flood.
And when people get swept away, they usually fall into one of two camps. They either worship the unbound energy, they lean into the tribal outrage, they idolize aggressive, reactive leaders,
right?
Or they fear it completely, retreating into severe anxiety and isolation. Both are just reactions to Kali sitting on the throne. Both are symptoms of a missing internal control rod.
We've covered incredible ground today. From the cosmic descent of the yugas down to the psychological descent into our own reactive emotions and finally mapping it onto our current informational landscape.
It's a massive framework.
It really is. Kali Enthroned proves to be so much more than just a dramatic piece of mythological artwork. It is a razor-sharp diagnostic tool for the 21st century.
It absolutely is.
We've seen how the loss of the vertical axis, the loss of the logos and pure awareness, inevitably leads to a world where power entirely replaces presence. We get the horizontal, turbulent chaos of unbound energy, both in our own minds and in our civilization.
And that leads to a very clear mandate for the individual. The goal is to focus intensely on strengthening your own inner vertical axis.
So the takeaway for you listening today is this. The next time you feel completely overwhelmed by the chaotic energy of, a family argument, a stressful day at work, or the wild turbulence of your newsfeed, remember the geometry of this ancient text.
To get the spinning top.
Exactly. Your primary objective is not to try and suppress that chaotic energy or to fight the algorithm or to numb yourself out. Your job is to return to being the unmoved witness.
You have to build a seat of awareness inside yourself that is profound enough to hold all of that horizontal chaos in its proper place.
Right, without letting it sit on the throne and dictate your reality.
This text leaves us with a formidable challenge, though. It states that genuine ascent requires a consciousness strong enough to reclaim the throne from this unbound energy.
Yeah.
But this raises an important question. If we are indeed living in an era where the collective unconscious and the global field are almost entirely dictated by highly turbulent reactive energy, how exactly does an individual forge that level of unshakable vertical strength? When the entire world is spinning horizontally, wobbling out of control like a dying top, what is the very first step you can take today to locate your true north?
What if the exhaustion, the chaos you feel every time you open your newsfeed isn't a sign that the world is breaking, but actually a mathematical guarantee that a cosmic cycle is functioning perfectly?
It's a pretty wild premise to start with.
Yeah, it really is. But you know the feeling. You wake up, you look at the state of the world, and there is just this overwhelming sense of collective burnout. Like everyone is exhausted, everything feels, a little chaotic, and you can't help but wonder if society is just randomly spinning out of control.
Yeah, that sense of just sort of spinning your wheels on a societal level.
Exactly. So today we are taking a deep dive into a profoundly heavy, really esoteric piece of writing titled 5, The Greater Timing and the Necessity of the Inversion.
It's quite the title.
Right. And our mission for you on this deep dive is to decode this incredibly dense, cyclical view of history. We're going to explore the argument that our current era of dysfunction isn't a pointless disaster at all.
Far from it, according to the source.
Yeah, instead it is framed as a necessary event horizon. And most importantly, we're going to figure out how this text suggests you can actually survive it, and maintain your sanity. Okay, let's unpack this. If we are in the middle of a massive cosmic cycle, where exactly does this source say we are standing right now?
Well, according to this text, we are positioned at a very specific and, frankly, a really uncomfortable point in that cycle. The author states that for many in the present generation, adulthood happens to coincide with what they call the zenith of the descending arc.
The zenith of the descending arc. That paints quite a picture.
It really does.
It implies we are at the absolute peak of a downward spiral, which feels incredibly counterintuitive. Like a peak is usually the top, right? The victory. But here, the peak is the absolute maximum weight of the descent.
Right. The text describes this moment as an event horizon. And to understand why, we really have to look at how the author introduces the concept of sukti.
Okay, sukti. What exactly is that in this context?
So in this specific philosophical context, Shakti represents unrestricted, unbound creative energy. The core argument is that this pure creative energy has already generated every single novel form it possibly can.
Wait, like every possible form?
Every single one. It has tried every configuration of society, every cultural expression, every technological paradigm. And because there is no genuine novelty left to produce, that once vibrant creative energy begins to curdle, it turns into entropy and rot.
Okay. I noticed the text defines entropy in a really unique way here. It's not using the standard physics definition, of energy dissipating in a closed system.
No, it's much more specific than that.
Yeah, it defines entropy specifically as the exhaustion of novelty.
Exactly. We usually think of entropy as just random decay, right? A sort of cosmic mistake where things fall apart because the universe is flawed.
Just things naturally breaking down over time.
But the text insists that this entropy is not cosmically pointless at all. Once every single expression born of this unbound energy has been tried and, well, exhausted, the only things left for the system to do are repetition and decay.
So it's not broken.
No, the system is functioning exactly as it is designed to. It has simply run out of fresh material.
Man, I was reading this, and the analogy that instantly popped into my head was an open-world video game.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, imagine you're playing this massive, sprawling game, and you have put hundreds of hours into it. You've unlocked every single map, you've completed every main quest, every side quest, you've customized every character to the absolute limit.
You've literally done everything there is to do.
Right. There is literally nothing genuinely new left to create or discover in the code of the game. So what do players do when they hit that point?
They usually start messing around. Right?
Exactly. The gameplay devolves into chaotic, pointless destruction. You start spawning exploding barrels in the middle of a peaceful town just to see what happens, or, you start driving cars off cliffs.
Yeah, just absolute chaos for the sake of it.
You aren't doing it to achieve a goal. You're doing it because the system has literally run out of new ideas, and destruction is the only way to squeeze any remaining stimulation out of the environment.
That is a perfect analogy, because when that system runs out of ideas, it doesn't just pause, it turns cannibalistic. Without new forms to take, the energy becomes a destructive repetition.
It feeds on itself.
Right. And the Source makes a very profound philosophical turn here. It argues that this descending dark current, which it refers to as Kali enthroned, is absolutely necessary for existence itself.
Okay, we should probably pause on that term. Kali enthroned. Who is Kali in this context, and why is she sitting on the throne during this phase of the cycle?
So it invokes Kali, the ancient Hindu goddess of time, destruction, and, well, radical change. She represents the ultimate consuming force that dismantles illusions and tears down the old structures.
The ultimate destroyer.
Exactly. By saying Kali is enthroned, the text means that the governing principle of our current era is not creation or preservation, but the ruthless dismantling of exhausted forms. She rules the descending arc.
And the text says this is mathematically essential, right?
It argues that her rule is mathematically essential because without it, you only have what the author calls a sterile sky.
Sterile sky, meaning like a reality of perfect, unchanging order.
A reality of perfect light and structure, yeah. Which sounds wonderful until you realize that a purely sterile sky could never actually generate the vivid richness of existence.
Because there's no movement.
Exactly. Order only defines itself against the drag of chaos. Without the opposition of this descending arc, there is no tension. There is no contrast at all. If everything is perfectly harmonious and unchanging, there is no friction to create a distinct individual life.
Oh, wow. So you need the dark current to even perceive the light. The chaos gives the order its definition. It's like how a shadow gives a three-dimensional object its depth, right? Without the shadow, it's just a flat, blinding plane.
That tension is what makes reality real. And what's fascinating here is the text actually parallels this cyclical movement with other ancient frameworks to show how universal this idea of necessary friction is.
Oh, right. It brings in some unexpected comparisons.
Yeah, it points directly to the Genesis narrative in the Bible, but viewed through the specific cyclical lens.
The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. The text suggests that when the serpent influences Adam and Eve, that serpent represents the same Sakti we just talked about, that unbound creative energy pushing for a new form.
Pushing them to do something novel.
Right. The result of eating the fruit is the birth of real, self-aware individuality.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, it is the fall. Novelty and exile arrive at the exact same moment.
You get the knowledge, you get the self-awareness, but the price of that individuality is that you get kicked out of the perfect harmony of the garden.
You can't have one without the other.
You literally cannot have the expansion of consciousness without the friction of exile.
Because in a state of perfect harmony, you don't really exist as an individual, you know. You are just a seamless part of the garden.
Just background scenery.
Basically. The text applies this paradox to what it calls the Tantric register. Because if novelty and exile come together, and if the exhaustion of novelty brings inevitable chaos, the core question for the individual living through it becomes, how do we view this decay?
Is it just a terrible thing happening to us?
Right. Is it a punishment for humanity, or is it a hidden opportunity?
Okay, before we get to whether it's an opportunity, what does the text mean by the Tantric register? Because that's a term that gets thrown around a lot in pop culture, usually totally out of context.
Oh, absolutely out of context. In a genuine Tantric philosophical framework, you don't run away from the dark, chaotic, or taboo aspects of reality.
You don't just hide from the bad stuff.
Right. You don't try to purify yourself by hiding in a cave. Instead, you figure out how to consume that toxic energy and metabolize it. You turn the poison into medicine.
That is intense.
Tantra is about using the raw, unfiltered friction of reality as a direct engine for spiritual liberation. So when the text applies this to our current chaotic era, it leans heavily into the idea of opportunity. It actually goes so far as to call this chaotic age a gold mine.
Wait, I have to push back on this.
Okay, go for it.
The text literally says, this era is saturated with rakasas and pretas, which translates to demons and hungry ghosts, right?
It does, yes.
So how can living in a time saturated with hungry ghosts be a gold mine? Isn't a peaceful, enlightened era infinitely better for personal growth than having to constantly fend off literal chaos?
Well, most of us would certainly prefer the peaceful era.
Okay.
I mean, it is much more comfortable.
Much less exhausting.
Exactly. But the text argues that a peaceful environment doesn't forge the strongest tools. When the field, meaning our collective environment or reality, is saturated with these hungry ghosts and unbound erratic forces, it creates an extreme, crushing level of psychological and spiritual pressure.
Like a forge.
Yes. And it is precisely that extreme pressure that calls forth the most direct and wrathful methods of realization. Soft times produce gentle methods. You can meditate quietly by a stream when the world is at peace. But event horizons produce fierce deities and rapid, uncompromising paths.
Ah, so the intensity of the environment forces you to either wake up immediately or get crushed. There's no luxury of taking your time.
There's no middle ground anymore.
Yeah.
Any contemporary system or individual capable of metabolizing this level of modern chaos is a fruit that could only ripen under these exact pressures.
So the chaos is the fertilizer.
Right. The goal, according to the source, isn't to try and suppress this massive upsurge of unconscious power we're seeing in the world. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
It's already out.
Instead, the goal is to see through it, to strip the chaos of its claim to the throne and actually harvest it as fuel. If you hold the right view, the friction of this descending arc is the exact fuel you use to wake up.
Okay, so we are establishing that this era is a gold mine for individual realization if you can handle the heat. But it's still undeniably chaotic for the collective.
Oh, absolutely.
We talked a lot about cosmic cycles and energy, but what does this exhaustion of novelty actually look like in our day-to-day physical world? How does this cosmic curdle manifest in society?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the text states that the classical pattern of this inversion reaches its extreme by intensifying consequences.
Meaning things just get worse and worse.
Basically, the system just keeps dialing up the heat and the absurdity until the exhaustion of the old ways becomes utterly undeniable to everyone. And this leads to the rapid expansion of what the author calls dead zones.
Dead zones, that sounds ominous.
The root cause of these dead zones is described as the sterility of pure horizontal power.
Let's define horizontal power here, because that feels like the linchpin of why everything is breaking down.
Sure. If vertical power is about meaning, transcendence, depth, and looking upward to a higher principle, or truth horizontal power is just spreading out on a flat plane.
Like a sprawl.
Exactly. It is expansion for the sake of expansion. It's accumulating more wealth, claiming more territory, gaining more influence, more clicks, more likes.
More and more.
It is building a massive empire of stuff and metrics without any deeper vertical meaning anchoring it to reality.
So why does that horizontal expansion inevitably lead to things like collapsing trust and collapsing birth rates, which the text mentions? What is the actual mechanism breaking those things down?
Think about it. When a society only values horizontal expansion, people become mere economic units. the deep vertical meaning required to raise a family, to build a lasting community, or even to just trust your neighbor evaporates.
Because everything is just a transaction?
Right. Why would you trust your neighbor if society tells you that you are both just competing for the same surface-level resources? Why would you bring a child into a world if the overarching narrative is just endless, meaningless consumption?
There's no anchor.
The sterility of a purely material, flat existence provides no compelling metaphysical reason to perpetuate life or build deep bonds. The overarching narrative falls apart, and these dead zones expand in our institutions and in our own minds.
The text describes this paradoxical phase we're in as achieving maximum clarity through maximum dysfunction.
It's a great phrase.
I was trying to wrap my head around how dysfunction creates clarity, and it reminds me of a toxic romantic relationship.
Okay, tell me more.
You can be in a bad relationship for years, and it's confusing, it's murky. You're constantly making excuses for the other person, settling for a mediocre middle ground.
Right, you sort of exist in it.
Yeah, but then you have that final, absolute blowout, explosive fight. It is incredibly painful. It is maximum dysfunction. But it finally provides the undeniable clarity you needed to realize, oh, this is deeply broken and I have to leave.
The illusion is completely shattered.
Exactly. The extreme dysfunction provides the clarity that the comfortable, murky middle ground never could.
That is exactly the mechanism the text is describing, just scaled up to a civilizational level. The dysfunction in our institutions, our politics, and our social contracts has to reach an absolute fever pitch so that no one can deny the exhaustion of the old order anymore. The mask has to fall off completely.
Which brings it right down to daily life for you, the person listening to this. Think about your own daily news feeds. Think about the conversations you have with your friends and family. Where are you personally seeing these dead zones?
They're everywhere once you start looking.
Where are you seeing that collapse of trust and meaning? Because according to this text, recognizing that collapse isn't a reason to fall into despair, it's actually the maximum clarity you need to understand where we are in the cycle.
And recognizing those dead zones brings us to the ultimate existential question of the text.
Which is?
If we are trapped in this gap where the old order is collapsing under the weight of its own horizontal power, but the new one isn't born yet, we can't just float in the void forever. How does this cycle actually resolve itself? What survives the collapse?
Right. The text introduces the possibility of re-enthronement as the resolution. But hold on, re-enthronement sounds incredibly regressive. Are they just arguing for a return to some imaginary golden age of kings? Because that sounds like, I don't know, a reactionary fantasy.
It does sound like that at first glance, but it is very careful to clarify that it is not a nostalgic return. It is not a reversion to a past yuga, which is a previous epoch in ancient Indian philosophy.
So we aren't going backwards?
Not at all. The text is warning us not to fall into the trap of thinking, if we just go back to the way things were 50 years ago or 200 years ago, everything will be fine. You cannot reverse a cosmic cycle any more than you can reverse the seasons.
You can't unring the bell.
Right. Re-enthronement is not rewinding the clock. Instead, it is the reemergence of a logos, a guiding principle or fundamental cosmic order that has itself been tempered and hardened by having passed through the full eclipse.
So the order that comes next isn't naive. It has survived the fire of the inversion.
Exactly. It's been tested. The text introduces the concept of the citadel to describe this next phase. And the citadel will not be built by the masses.
Who builds it then?
It will be built from what it calls the nodes, meaning the specific individuals, who refused to abdicate the vertical axis while the power of the inversion raged unbound around them. They are the ones who kept the seat of awareness intact when everyone else dissolved into the chaos.
Okay, let's make this tangible. What does it practically mean for you, the listener, to hold the vertical axis when you're just trying to pay rent, feed your kids, and survive in a world where the old order is functionally dead?
It's the million-dollar question.
It's easy to talk about vertical axis in a philosophy text, but what does that look like on a Tuesday morning?
Well, practically it means making choices that prioritize depth and integrity over horizontal expansion, even when society actively punishes you for it.
Give me an example.
For example, when your industry incentivizes you to outrage farm on social media to gain horizontal reach and followers, you refuse to do it, even if you lose status or money.
That's a good one.
Or it means choosing to build a deep physical community in your actual neighborhood, rather than spending hours doom scrolling and engaging in abstract digital warfare.
So it's about opting out of the flat game.
Yes. It is taking an action that might cost you horizontal points, wealth, clout, easy convenience, but protects your psychological and spiritual integrity. The text acknowledges that we are in the hardest segment of the entire cycle. The old order is dead, the new one isn't born.
And in that gap, the choices are incredibly stark. You can't just casually participate in society anymore without making a definitive choice.
You really can't. The author states the only coherent choices are to either dissolve with the field, meaning you give in to the horizontal power, you become a hungry ghost chasing metrics and outrage, or you hold the vertical axis against the current at real cost.
At real cost. That's the most important part of that sentence, I think. It is not going to be profitable or comfortable in the short term to maintain that integrity.
Not at all. The text states plainly that having this cosmic perspective doesn't erase the suffering of being alive at the event horizon.
It still hurts.
It genuinely hurts to live in a time of collapsing meaning. You will feel the friction. But the crucial pivot here is that the suffering is not meaningless.
It is the friction required for the harvest. You are the fruit ripening under extreme pressure.
Exactly. The harvest of this specific age is a fierce, uncompromising clarity that softer, easier ages simply could not produce. You are being forged.
It's an initiation.
It is. The next movement of the cycle is simply further intensification and sorting. The pressure will continue to rise, but the slow reestablishment of the throne, the building of the new citadel, will be done exclusively by those who never fully surrendered their inner vertical axis to the mob.
And the text ends with this incredibly powerful dismissal of the daily chaos. It just says, everything else is weather.
Such a great line.
I love that framing so much. The collapsing trust, the expanding dead zones, the political theater, the exhaustion of novelty. It's all just weather. You don't stand in your yard and scream at a thunderstorm.
No, you'd look crazy.
Right. You just weather it, you protect what matters, and you hold your ground until the storm passes.
That is the core of the critical thinking this text demands from the reader. True awareness means recognizing the mathematical cycle you are in, rather than fighting it blindly or taking it personally.
You just accept where we are.
You are at an event horizon where novelty has exhausted itself. The chaos is a certainty of this phase.
So your task, listening to this, isn't to panic over the collapse of meaning. You don't need to save the old order.
Let it fall.
Yeah. Your task is to metabolize the chaos, to use the maximum dysfunction to gain maximum clarity about what actually matters, to hold your vertical axis, even at a personal cost, so that you can become the seed for that future citadel.
This completely reframes the concept of societal burnout. It is not a symptom of random failure or cosmic bad luck. It is simply the exhaustion of a system that has run out of forms, leaving you with the ultimate responsibility to maintain the seat of awareness while the system resets.
Which brings us right back to that overwhelming feeling we started with. If the chaos is just the weather of a dying cycle, then your attention shouldn't be entirely consumed by the storm.
It's a waste of energy.
Exactly. It should be intensely focused on what you are protecting from the rain. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today, building on this idea of the new order. If the citadel of the future is indeed built by those who maintain their inner vertical axis while the external world dissolves into weather, what is the one undeniable truth or daily practice you hold right now that acts as your anchor?
That's a profound question.
Think about it. If everything else in the horizontal world were stripped away tomorrow, the metrics, the noise, the endless digital novelties, the outrage, what is the single uncompromising brick you would use to start building your own citadel?
I want you to imagine, just for a second, the most chaotic, groundless era possible.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Like a time when every single foundational rule of reality, the very things you rely on to just wake up and navigate your daily life, they just seem to have completely vanished.
Right. Just totally gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Up is down. The bedrock is crumbled. And you are just sort of floating in this incredibly turbulent, unpredictable space.
It's a terrifying thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
And if you have ever felt that way, whether you're looking at the world at large, you're checking the news and feeling that pit in your stomach, or maybe just dealing with your own massive personal upheaval, then today's deep dive is designed specifically for you.
It really is, because, well, that feeling of complete groundlessness, that sense that the floor has literally fallen out from under you, it isn't just a modern anxiety.
Right.
It is a profoundly ancient psychological state. Humanity has been experiencing it and, trying to map it out for centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a really fascinating document in front of us today that does exactly that.
Yeah. It's an incredible piece.
It's a striking piece of visual analysis titled The Displacement of the Vajra Axis. Now, our mission for this deep dive is to decode this incredibly intense layered imagery. We want to understand what it tells us about surviving and maybe even evolving during times of absolute chaos.
Which is so relevant right now.
Exactly. But before we get into the really heavy stuff, we need to understand what this document actually is, right?
That's a crucial starting point. I mean, this text isn't just a piece of art critique or some historical review of old paintings.
Right. It's not an art history lesson.
No, not at all. It is meant to be a literal map of consciousness. It's trying to show us how the human mind attempts to find its footing when the world turns completely upside down.
Wow.
But to grasp the sheer panic of the inversion we're going to talk about, you have to picture the classical order first. You have to know what the world looks like when it's actually working.
Makes sense. So what is the baseline?
Well, in traditional iconography of this specific mythological framework, you have a dynamic between two immense forces, Shiva and Kali.
Okay.
Classically, Shiva lies flat beneath Kali's feet to arrest her wild dance.
Wait, let me see if I am grasping this classical setup before we break it.
Yeah.
Kali is dancing, and Shiva is literally the floor she dances on.
In a sense, yeah. Shiva represents the static, observing, unmoving consciousness. He is the unmoving ground.
Got her.
He absorbs the kinetic fury of the cosmos so that the world didn't just shatter under the weight of her movement.
Oh.
Kali, on the other hand, she represents absolute kinetic dynamism. She is change, she is time, and she is the destruction of the old.
Right. She's pure motion.
Exactly. So in a balanced cosmos, her wild kinetic energy is held and stabilized by his immovable foundation.
Okay, I'm trying to put this in, modern terms. Is it kind of like a cosmic shock absorber on a car?
Oh, I like that.
Because, think about it. If I'm driving over incredibly rough, rocky terrain, which I guess represents Kali's kinetic fury and constant change, that shock absorber takes all that violent kinetic energy and grounds it.
Right.
It buffers the impact so that the passengers, meaning us and the world itself, don't get violently thrown through the windshield. The vehicle stays intact.
I think that's a very practical way to visualize it. I mean, the shock absorber doesn't stop the car from moving, right?
Well, you're still driving.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop the terrain from being rough.
Yeah.
But it makes the journey survivable. But in the visual rendering we are analyzing today, the text says the inversion is complete.
Meaning the shock absorber failed.
Worse. That shock absorber hasn't just failed. It has been ripped out of the vehicle entirely.
Oh, man. And that leads to the first stage of this inversion, which the text calls the skycast adrift.
The imagery there is incredible.
It is just haunting. Shiva isn't the bedrock beneath the dance anymore. He has been violently unseated. The visual describes him as being cast upward into the sky, horizontal, and completely immobilized. He is drifting on this broken chunk of ruined architecture, and all of this is happening beneath an eclipsed black sun.
It's so stark.
It's like the ordering principle of the universe is just floating away like space debris.
It's a terrifying visual, honestly, because he can no longer touch the ground. The bedrock is completely gone. And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
When the static center, that stabilizing force, is violently displaced like that, something has to fill that void. And that brings us to the next phase.
What the text calls the seat of sovereignty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kali doesn't just continue dancing in the empty void. She occupies the carved throne directly.
Right. So the power that belongs to kinetic dynamism is basically seized the static center.
Yes. She's sitting in the seat of power, and she is heavily armed.
Yeah. The text notes she brandishes a skull cup, a severed head, a crescent blade, and a trident. Now, the text mentions that normally these items would be seen as symbolic instruments of spiritual liberation within an integrated mandala.
Yes, normally.
Wait, for the listener who isn't, steeped in Eastern iconography, what exactly do you mean by an integrated mandala here?
That's a great question. So a mandala is essentially a geometric map of a perfected, balanced universe.
Okay.
In a balanced era, when you see a deity holding a terrifying weapon like a severed head or a crescent blade, those weapons are metaphorical.
Like they aren't literal threats.
Right. They represent cutting through ignorance or destroying the ego. They are spiritual tools meant to help you achieve enlightenment within a safe, structured, and balanced cosmic blueprint.
Ah, okay. So they're usually symbols in a spiritual teaching. But in this inverted image we are looking at, the text is very clear that they are no longer just spiritual metaphors.
Not at all, because there is no stabilizing ground, right? There's no mandala to contain them anymore. So these weapons are no longer integrated spiritual tools.
So what are they?
They represent, as the text explicitly states, the raw, unbuffered law of the realm.
Raw, unbuffered law. That sounds incredibly severe.
It is. What's fascinating here is the implication for the actual rules of reality. When the shock absorber is gone, the law of the realm becomes pure impact.
Just pure impact. Wow.
Yeah, it is harsh, immediate, and utterly lacking in grace or, mitigation. The ruling principle is no longer a balance of stillness and motion.
It's just force.
Exactly. It is just relentless, slicing, unmitigated kinetic force, action, and immediate, brutal reaction.
Hold on. I'm struggling with this next part of the analysis then. If Kali is sitting on the throne and imposing this incredibly harsh, raw, unbuffered law, why does the basement of the world break open?
What do you mean?
Well, wouldn't a harsh, brutal ruler keep the basement locked tighter than ever? If she is wielding absolute kinetic fury, shouldn't she be suppressing whatever's underneath?
You would think so, yeah, if her law were structural. But her law isn't structural at all. It's entirely kinetic.
What does that mean, practically?
Think about the difference between, say, a heavy iron vault door and a massive explosion. The iron vault door is structural law, that's Siva. It just sits there, heavy, unmoving, keeping whatever's in the basement locked away.
Right.
Kali is the explosion. When pure kinetic energy takes the throne, it doesn't reinforce structures, it shakes them apart.
Oh, I see.
Because Siva, the heavy grounding principle, is gone, the foundational seal of the world is actually shattered by the vibrations of her unmitigated dynamism.
Oh, wow. Okay, that makes complete sense. The harsh law isn't a lock, it's a jackhammer.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Which takes us directly into the second phase of this visual analysis, which the source text calls the chthonic surge. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this part is wild.
The text describes the space beneath the throne transforming from solid earth into a boiling sea of magma and serpentine coils. It's this active, volatile, burning liquid. And out of this abyss rise horned, fanged figures.
Right.
What literally are these creatures in the mythology before we get into what they actually mean?
Well, in the literal mythology, these figures are the Nagas and Asuras. Nagas are essentially serpent deities that live in the subterranean depths, and Asuras are often described as anti-gods or power-seeking entities that exist in the lower realms.
But again, we aren't just looking at a fantasy painting of subterranean monsters here. This is a map of the human mind.
Yes, and this is where the psychological weight of this imagery becomes incredibly clear. The text identifies these rising serpent deities and anti-gods as the direct personification of the unintegrated collective unconscious.
The unintegrated collective unconscious. Let's break that down for a second.
Sure.
We are talking about all the dark, suppressed, chaotic, instinctual drives of humanity that we usually keep buried deep in the basement of our minds. The greed, the panic, the primal fears, the tribalism.
Exactly. In a balanced era, the vertical seal of the psyche represented by the bedrock of Siva, or even just the structural norms of society, keeps those forces largely subterranean.
Right, like you and I don't have to deal with our most primal, terrifying survival instincts when we just go to the grocery store.
Exactly, because the structure holds. But here, the vertical seal is broken. The unconscious is flooding the conscious world.
Wow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, think about what happens in times of immense societal or personal upheaval.
Okay.
When institutions fail or when someone goes through a massive personal trauma, the normal rules fall away. Suddenly you see behaviors, mass panics, and raw primal fears emerging in the collective that you thought were long buried by civilization.
So basically, the universe's basement flooded, the landlord is gone, and the rats are throwing a massive rager.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
It's exactly like opening a pressure valve on the human psyche. If the conscious world is ruled by raw kinetic law, the pressure inside the system changes, and all the dark, suppressed material just comes rushing up to the surface.
It does.
It is terrifying. But honestly, based on how you just explained the kinetic law, It is entirely logical.
Yeah.
And there's a detail in the text that I find really chilling. These monsters, these fanged and horned figures rising from the boiling magma, they don't rebel against Kali. They don't try to overthrow this brutal new throne.
No, they don't challenge the throne at all. In fact, the text explicitly states that they feed it and celebrate it.
Which seems counterintuitive at first, you know? Why would the chaotic forces of the underworld celebrate a ruler who is dispensing harsh, unbuffered law with a severed head and a crescent blade?
Because, as the analysis points out, the lower strata recognize their own native frequency in the ascending fire.
Their native frequency.
Right. They are creatures of chaos, instinct, and raw power. When the world was stable, peaceful, and bound by structural laws, they were trapped.
Suppressed in the basement.
Exactly. But now that the world is an unmitigated disaster of kinetic fury, they are in their element. Chaos is their native frequency. They thrive on it.
So they don't want to fix it.
No, they don't want to overthrow the destruction. They want to participate in it.
Man. So if you are listening to this and you are taking stock of this imagery, you have a reality where the stabilizing force is floating away in space. The law is harsh and unyielding, and the darkest parts of the collective unconscious are boiling up to the surface and having a massive party because the world is finally as messed up as they are.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. You might be feeling incredibly overwhelmed right now. This is heavily doom-laden imagery. It literally sounds like a psychological apocalypse.
It certainly looks like one. And, if you stop the analysis right there, it is just a picture of an apocalypse.
Right.
But this text is deeply philosophical. We have to look at the purpose of this event horizon. Why is this chthonic surge, this breaking of the world, philosophically necessary?
Right, because there is a massive pivot in the text here. It moves from describing the horror to describing the opportunity.
Yes.
The visual signature we've been talking about, the eclipsed sun, the drifting bedrock, the bloodthirsty throne, the boiling sea of monsters. The text calls all of this the visual signature of the crucible.
The crucible, a vessel in which substances are subjected to immense heat and pressure to melt them down, purify them, and forge something entirely new.
And the text contrasts this crucible with what it calls soft, balanced eras.
Right.
It says that in comfortable times, realization is slow and gradual.
Yeah.
Nobody evolves when they're binge-watching TV in a comfortable era.
Because the contrast is low. When the world is functioning normally, when the shock absorbers are working and the basement is securely locked, you don't have to push yourself to understand the deeper nature of reality or your own mind.
You can just coast.
Exactly. You can be comfortable. There is a middle ground where you can exist without having to make hard existential choices about who you actually are.
But in the world of this image, there is no middle ground. The text has this incredible line. Let me find it. You cannot build a comfortable life on an active lava flow.
That line is so powerful. It raises an important question for anyone navigating a chaotic period in their life. How much energy are you wasting trying to build a comfortable, normal routine on top of an active lava flow? This era, this state of consciousness, is what the text calls the fuel of the eon.
The fuel.
Yes. The extreme heat, the utter lack of comfort is the literal fuel required for a massive leap in personal evolution.
So what does this all mean? We have the lava flow. We have the loss of the bedrock. It means we have arrived at what the text calls the absolute sorting.
Yes. The sheer extremity of this inversion forces you, the listener, to make a definitive choice.
Because the middle ground is gone.
The illusion of the middle ground is gone. You really only have two options.
Okay, lay them out. Option one.
Option one, you drown in the serpentine boiling sea.
Yikes.
You let the unintegrated collective unconscious pull you under. You give in to the panic, the tribalism, the chaos, and the primal fear, and you just become part of the magma.
And option two.
Option two is you forge an unshakable, indestructible interior diamond. Exactly. The text uses the Sanskrit word Vajra, which means both diamond and thunderbolt. It represents a state of being that is absolutely indestructible and luminous. You forge an interior Vajra that cannot be burned by the fire.
Okay, pause. Let me challenge you on this. Because forging an interior diamond sounds great on like a motivational poster, but practically, how do I do that?
That's the real challenge.
Right. I can't just wish myself into a diamond while the world is literally on fire and I'm floating in space. What is the actual psychological mechanism here?
That is the most important question. If Siva, the external bedrock, the stabilizing institutions of society, the predictable norms of your life, If all that is gone, you can't rely on the external world to stabilize you anymore.
So I have to become Siva.
Yes, you have to become your own bedrock. The mechanism for doing this requires radical acceptance and the building of immense distress tolerance.
Radical acceptance of the lava flow.
Exactly. You stop trying to pretend the ground is still there.
Yeah.
You stop wishing for a soft, balanced era. Forging the interior diamond means you practice observing the chaos without getting swept up in the reactivity. When the unconscious fears boil up, when you feel panic, anger, or despair, you don't suppress them because, well, you can't anymore.
The pressure valve is open.
Right. But you don't act on them either. You hold a space of pure, observing consciousness within yourself.
You just let it burn.
You let the heat of the emotion burn, but you refuse to let it dictate your actions. Over time, that practice holding still in the center of unbearable psychological heat and pressure crystallizes your consciousness.
That perfectly brings up the literal physics of a diamond. I mean, how is a diamond created in the natural world?
Through pressure.
Unbelievable, crushing pressure and extreme subterranean heat.
Precisely. The lava flow, the chthonic surge, the unbuffered law of the realm, all the things that make this image so terrifying are the exact environmental conditions required to create a diamond.
Wow.
Without the extreme pressure and the unbearable heat, the carbon just stays carbon. It never crystallizes. You need the chaos to force the evolution.
So you are literally using the destruction of the external world as the forge for your internal world.
That's exactly it.
That is such a profound way to look at it. Which brings us to the final conclusion of the text. It acknowledges that the image captures the full weight of the descent. It doesn't sugarcoat it at all.
No, it doesn't.
The fire is real. The throne is claimed by kinetic fury. But, it says, the work remains.
And the text defines that work beautifully. The ultimate work is, quote, holding the vertical axis in the center of the storm until the wheel turns.
Holding the vertical axis, meaning when the world is spinning horizontally, when everything is caught in this massive, chaotic washing machine of kinetic energy, your only job is to be that vertical line of stillness we just talked about.
Yes!
You stay in the center of the storm, observing, not reacting, just being the bedrock.
We started this deep dive by asking you to imagine the most chaotic, groundless era possible. And it is so easy when you look at the world and see the lava flowing and the monsters rising to feel completely helpless, to feel like the world is just ending and there is absolutely nothing you can do.
But this map of consciousness tells us the exact opposite.
It really does.
It tells us that when your own world feels like a high contrast era, you have a very specific active job. Don't try to build a comfortable life on it. Don't waste your precious energy pretending the shock absorbers still work.
Because they don't.
Right. View it as an absolute sorting. It is an opportunity, maybe the only opportunity, to forge your own indestructible interior diamond.
You hold that vertical axis. You find that unshakable stillness inside yourself, building that distress tolerance, knowing that the fire cannot burn the diamond.
And that leaves us with one final lingering thought to explore today. The text tells us that the ultimate work is holding this vertical axis until the wheel turns. Now, we know from our discussion that the monsters rising from the abyss represent the unintegrated collective unconscious. They are a reflection of humanity's deepest untamed fears and chaos.
They are. The outside world is reflecting the inside world.
So consider this. If the chaos outside is fundamentally a reflection of the unconscious inside, perhaps the act of forging your own indestructible inner diamond isn't just about your own personal survival.
It might be much bigger.
What if it is bigger than that? What if enough individuals standing in the boiling sea, choosing not to drown, choosing instead to hold that vertical axis of stillness and non-reactivity, what if that is the exact mechanical counterweight required to pull that eclipsed sun back into the light?
That's a staggering thought.
What if you becoming the bedrock is exactly what forces the cosmic wheel to finally turn, ending that chaotic, groundless era once and for all? It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself standing on an active lava flow.
Have you ever noticed that trying to argue with an internet troll, or even just trying to, fight off your own anxious thoughts at 3 a.m, it always seems to just multiply the problem?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It's the worst feeling.
Right. You see something online that is so clearly factually wrong, and you sit down, you type out this perfectly logical response, you back it up with citations, you hit reply, and suddenly, you are fighting 15 different arguments from people who somehow completely missed the point of what you were saying.
They always miss the point, yeah.
Or you're lying in bed, right, staring at the ceiling, and you try to reason your way out of a worry. You think, I don't need to stress about this meeting tomorrow because I have my notes.
Yeah, the classic rationalization.
Exactly. And instantly, your brain just spawns like 10 brand new worries out of that one logical thought. Now you're worried about whether your notes are formatted correctly or, I don't know, if you're going to lose your voice.
It's an incredibly isolating feeling in the moment, but, well, it's practically universally shared modern experience. We approach these deeply chaotic systems, whether we're talking about a sprawling online debate or just the internal ecosystem of our own anxiety, expecting that if we just, apply enough logic, we can fix it.
Because that's what we're taught to do, right?
Yeah.
Use reason.
Right. We assume reason is this ultimate tool, but in these specific environments, the structure itself actually becomes the fuel for the fire.
Which is wild. So today on The Deep Dive, we're looking at a fascinating stack of research that claims we've been trying to solve this modern technological and psychological problem entirely wrong.
Entirely wrong, yeah.
And ironically, to understand why our iPhones, our social media feeds, and our own anxious brains are kind of driving us crazy, our sources point us toward an ancient Hindu myth.
Which I know sounds like a massive leap.
It really does. But our mission today is to decode this source material. It uses the mythological figures of Raktabija, Kali, and Siva to map out the exact mechanics of our modern attention economy and our psychology.
And the mapping in the source material is startlingly precise. But to get this right, you got to throw out your usual cultural lens. We're so conditioned to view conflicts as a binary, good versus evil, order versus chaos, right versus wrong.
Right, the classic hero-villain setup.
Exactly. But the source material explicitly rejects that. It describes this three-tier nested polarity. It's a dynamic, interacting system. If you try to analyze our digital culture or our declining attention spans through a simple binary lens, well, you're going to misdiagnose the problem.
You'll prescribe the wrong cure, basically.
Yeah. We have to look at the entire system functioning as a whole.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we want to figure out how to find any kind of peace or stability in this incredibly chaotic, hyper-connected world you and I live in, we first have to understand the exact anatomy of the chaos we are fighting. We have to look at the monster itself.
And in this mythological framework, that monster is the demon Raktabija.
Raktabija, okay.
Yeah. Conceptually, what Raktabija represents is a runaway horizontal feedback loop. The story goes that this demon was granted a very specific, terrifying boon by the universe.
What kind of boon?
Every single time a drop of his blood fell to the battlefield and touched the earth, it would instantly sprout into a perfectly formed, fully grown clone of himself.
Wow. That is terrifying.
Right. So, saying the gods of order, they marched out to face him. They used their conventional weapons, swords, arrows, spears, the tools they had always used to maintain the structure of the cosmos.
The usual methods of control.
Exactly. But every single wound they inflicted just spilled more blood, creating thousands, then millions of new demons.
I was trying to think of a good way to picture this, and it actually reminds me of an audio feedback loop.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, like when someone takes a microphone and walks just a little too close to the speaker, the mic picks up the ambient noise, says it to the speaker plays it louder, the mic picks up that louder noise, and within 3 seconds you have this deafening, screeching howl.
And everyone in the room has to cover their ears.
Exactly. The sound itself becomes the weapon.
That captures the mechanics of it perfectly. Your attempt to amplify the signal is the very thing that destroys the system. Our source material takes this runaway horizontal feedback loop and maps it to two very specific modern domains.
The macro and the micro, right?
Right. Yeah. The macrocosm of the attention economy and the microcosm of our own conceptual minds. If we look at the macrocosm first, well, Raktabija is the algorithm.
Oh, okay.
Think about how a culture war event or a viral controversy functions on a structural level today.
And just to be absolutely clear for you listening, we aren't taking sides on any of these cultural debates. Left wing, right wing, Senate, none of that matters for this analysis. We are looking strictly at the mechanics of the machine itself.
Very important point, because the algorithm is entirely agnostic to the morality or the political leaning of the input. I mean, all it reads is engagement.
Right, it just wants clicks.
Exactly. Every time a hot-button issue or a manufactured outrage cycle or a carefully engineered algorithmic hook is dropped into the timeline, it acts as a strike against the demon. Whether your response is fierce critique, moral outrage, or even passionate cheering agreement, Your engagement drops what the source material calls data seeds into the societal substrate.
Data seeds. So every single click, every quote tweet, every angry comment is a drop of blood hitting the ground.
That's it. And each of those drops spawns 10,000 mirror threads, reaction videos, hot takes, and secondary panics. The initial event-like, the actual thing that happened, is almost immediately lost in a sprawling, replicating sea of commentary about the commentary.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. And the source material maps this same mechanism to the microcosm too, right? To the inside of our own heads.
Yeah, it refers to this as the discursive intellect, or vikalpa.
Vikalpa, got it.
This is exactly that 3 a.m. anxiety spiral you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
You have an unwanted, intrusive thought. So you try to attack it with another thought. You construct a defense.
Right, you try to logic your way out of it.
But that counter thought acts as a sword. It strikes the anxiety, spills mental blood, and a new, self-replicating neurosis sprouts immediately from the defense you just mounted. The intellect attacking the emotion just creates more surface area for the neurosis to attach to.
It just creates an endless chain of rationalizations. You're constantly fighting shadows of your own making.
Precisely.
Wait, I have to ask the question that naturally comes up here. If this system is running completely wild, if the algorithms are replicating cultural outrage and our own brains are replicating anxiety, why can't conventional order just step in and shut it down?
Like what, specifically?
Well, I mean, why can't we just institute better institutional rules or deploy rigorous logical debate or rely on standard fact-checking to defeat the chaos? It feels like we just need, better rules.
It feels that way, sure.
Yeah.
But conventional order operates under the rules of discrete objects. In the myth, the gods who failed to defeat Raktabija represent standard institutional order. Logic, established laws, structured debate. The text points out something vital. The weapons of order are, by definition, discrete, structured forms. They have boundaries. They have rules.
Right, like an argument has premises and a conclusion. A rule has a clear jurisdiction.
Exactly. When you bring a highly structured form into a runaway feedback loop, you are just providing more scaffolding for the chaos to climb.
More surface area.
Yes. Let's look at the literal technology behind our platforms. If you bring a highly structured, 10-point, heavily cited logical rebuttal to an internet troll, the algorithm doesn't process the validity of your logic.
It doesn't know what you're actually saying.
Right. The sentiment analysis AIs and natural language processors, they just index your formatting. They see keywords. They see a long dwell time. They map the relationships between your structured points and use that complex data to serve your post to more people who are statistically likely to be enraged by those specific keywords.
Wow. So your structured, well-meaning attempt at order literally feeds the machine the high-quality data it needs to multiply the conflict.
You're just giving Raktabija a bigger sword to cut himself with.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the source material doesn't just leave us stranded with this unstoppable replicating monster. It introduces a counterforce. But this force isn't a bigger sword, and it isn't a smarter god of logic. It's Kali.
Kali, yes. She represents the radical antidote. She succeeds precisely where the gods of order fail.
The text says Kali works because she is the total liquefaction of form. And when I was reading that, it made me think of a grease fire in a kitchen.
Oh, that's a really vivid image.
Yeah, because if a pan of grease catches fire on your stove, the worst thing you can possibly do is swat at it with a towel or, throw a bucket of water on it.
Because water has structure.
Exactly. Water has a specific chemical structure. When it hits the boiling grease, it instantly expands into steam, it aerosolizes the burning oil, and it blasts the fire all over your walls. Swatting at it or throwing water on it is like using the structured weapons of the conventional gods. You just aerosolize the crazy.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The only way to stop a grease fire is to smother it. You drop a heavy blanket over it and instantly suck all the oxygen out of the room. You don't fight the flames. You remove the environment that allows the flames to hold their shape.
And Kali does exactly that, just on a cosmic scale. She does not argue with the clones. She does not strike them with structured weapons.
So what does she do?
In the mythology, she expands her form, extends her tongue over the entire battlefield, and drinks the blood directly from the air before it can ever touch the ground.
Wow.
Yeah. She consumes the data seeds before they have the chance to crystallize into another intellectualized subsystem. She absorbs the attention charge itself.
But it's translate that for me. What does a terrifying goddess drinking the blood of a replicating demon actually look like in our digital world? What's the macro parallel to that?
It looks like cultural burnout, complete societal exhaustion.
It's just everyone hitting a wall.
Exactly. The chaotic, overwhelming flood of raw, unmediated data and hyper-accelerated culture eventually becomes so intensely dense that it destroys the human capacity for superficial distraction. The algorithmic churn reaches what the text calls terminal velocity.
Terminal velocity. So it's moving so fast it literally can't hold a shape anymore.
Right. Think about the lifespan of internet culture. I mean, a decade ago, a trend or a meme could hold the public's attention for months. Then it was weeks.
Now it's barely days.
Now a cultural phenomenon is born, cloned a million times, reacted to, dissected, and completely exhausted in a matter of hours. The sheer volume ceases to produce coherent culture and collapses into raw, incoherent noise.
The noise reaches a pitch where it just eats the signal.
Yes, that blur, that total liquefaction of the cultural form where nothing matters for more than 5 minutes, that is Kali at work. She's the chaotic flood that drowns the algorithmic clones by simply overloading the human nervous system until it breaks and stops caring.
And the source material talks about how this unmasking of the raw substratum affects us on an individual micro level too. It says this wild, sonic surge strips the discursive mind of all its polite intellectual games. It ends conceptual pretension.
Because you can't sustain an artificial, highly neurotic 10-step debate about your online persona when you are suddenly confronted with raw survival or primal terror or just absolute aesthetic shock.
It's like if you were sitting at a corner cafe agonizing over the exact phrasing of an email to your boss to make sure you sound sufficiently smart and dedicated, you're completely caught in this internal loop.
We've all been there.
Right. And suddenly 2 cars collide in the intersection right outside the window. The glass shakes. In that millisecond, the 10-step identity debate is completely vaporized. You drop your phone. The raw, primal reality of the moment entirely liquefies your conceptual pretensions. The noise of the real world consumes the artificial structure. Kali has entered the room.
The intensity of the real consumes the fragile architecture of the ego. But, observing this terminal velocity in our digital culture forces us to confront something incredibly challenging about the technology itself.
I was just thinking that if this intense algorithmic churn is driving our society to the state of pure, unstructured noise, if it's pushing us toward this inevitable burnout, are these algorithms an alien force? Did a bunch of coders in Silicon Valley build a machine that is doing this to us against our will? Or is the algorithm just a mirror, showing us who we really are when the lights are off and no one is looking?
This raises an important question, and it is arguably the most unsettling revelation in the entire source material. We have this tendency to view technology as a tool that exists separate from human nature.
Like it's just this pristine mathematical thing.
Right, a pristine mathematical system that maybe got a little out of hand, but the text argues something much darker. Let's introduce a concept the text contrasts this with, Dharmakaya.
Dharmakaya.
Dharmakaya refers to the transcendent essence of reality in pristine, perfectly silent stillness. The algorithm is absolutely not that.
Yeah, the internet is definitely not a perfectly still mountain lake.
Far from it. The text argues the algorithms are the unmasked mechanical mirror of human desire and shadow. The Sanskrit term used here is vasana.
Vasana, what does that cover exactly?
Vasana refers to our deep, underlying behavioral tendencies, our subliminal traits, and our raw karmic imprints.
So it's not a silicon monster from outer space doing this to us, it's us. The algorithm is just our own stripped nervous system projected onto a screen.
What the algorithms did was take off the polite, civilized mask of human social structures. For millennia, human behavior was largely constrained by shame, by local traditions, by the physical geography of living in a small community where you had to look your neighbors in the eye the next morning.
You couldn't just say whatever you wanted without consequences.
Exactly. The internet removed physical geography. The algorithm removed the friction of shame. And what did it reveal? It revealed exactly what the collective human unconscious craves when it is entirely unconstrained by structure.
It craves outrage. It craves tribal violence, short horizon lust, vanity, and primal fear. That is a brutal mirror to look into.
It really is.
It's like lifting up a beautifully manicured paving stone in a garden and seeing all the pale, frantic bugs scurrying around in the dirt underneath, but we're seeing it on a global scale.
What's fascinating here is how the source material frames this through a specific tantric revelation. In this view, the machine, the algorithm, acts as a siddhamatra, which translates to a fierce mirror or a mind-only projection.
A fierce mirror.
Yeah. It's showing humanity its own raw, unintegrated debris in real time. We are staring at our own teeth.
It's holding up a high-definition 4K screen to our collective shadow.
The text describes this state as the essence in its descending dynamic aspect, referred to as Shakti or Prakriti. Think of Shakti and Prakriti as pure kinetic energy. It is power running completely wild without the coordinating light of pure awareness to steer it.
It's an engine running with no driver.
Exactly. And because it is disconnected from wisdom, this pure desire manifests as this chaotic, replicating demon of the attention economy. It's just momentum for the sake of momentum.
So what does this all mean? If Ruptured is the algorithm feeding on our engagement, and Kali is the terminal velocity of that algorithm, the chaotic force that consumes the noise by overloading the system until it burns out, where does that actually leave us?
Well, we have to look.
So Ruptured is the infection, and Kali is the fever, the immune system kicking into overdrive to burn it out. But if a fever gets too high, it doesn't just kill the infection, it kills the patient. If Kali is just pure destruction, the total liquefaction of form, doesn't she just end up destroying the entire system? How does the cosmos survive its own immune response?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we find the resolution in the final layer of this dynamic system. Because Kali is pure kinetic power without internal direction, much like the raw algorithmic energy we just discussed, she cannot build the next world. She is only the solvent.
The solvent.
She is the fire, not the foundation.
So she just dances and destroys until the whole universe is gone.
She dances until she completely exhausts the demonic replication. She consumes every last drop of the noise. She sweeps the plane completely barren. And then, at the absolute climax of her frenzy, when there is nothing left to fight and nothing left to consume, she steps upon a body lying on the battlefield.
The third figure in the text, Shiva.
She steps upon the unmoving stone of Siva. And the moment her foot touches him, her tongue rolls out in shock, her frenzied dance breaks, and she becomes completely still.
Wow. Okay, so what does Siva actually represent in this framework? If the demon is the noise and the goddess is the burnout, what is the stone?
Siva represents the silent, unshakable bedrock of pure consciousness. He is the only thing in this entire mythological landscape that remained perfectly still while the entire world burned down around him.
He didn't fight back?
He did not fight the demon because, as we've established, fighting the demon with structured weapons just creates more demons. He did not join the frenzied dance of destruction. He simply remained as the unconditioned ground of being. He represents the pure awareness that was missing from the wild algorithmic churn.
He's the bottom of the ocean.
Yes, exactly.
Like, the surface is a Category 5 hurricane. That's Kali destroying Ruptured. There are 60-foot waves crashing, the noise is deafening, the water is just a chaotic blur. But if you take a submarine down 1,000 fathoms, it is pitch black, it is completely silent, and the water down there doesn't even ripple, the storm doesn't touch it. That's Siva.
The algorithmic clones, the tweets, the outrage cycles, the internal anxiety spirals are the violent weather on the surface. Kali is the hurricane that inevitably exhausts that weather system through pure, overwhelming intensity. But Shiva is the depth.
The depth that's always there.
He is the structural macro meaning of the entire myth. The chaotic burnout of our digital culture is necessary to sweep away all of this superficial replicating nonsense we've built. But the ultimate goal of the burnout isn't just destruction. The goal is to force the system to finally land on that unmoving stone.
To land on pure consciousness. To realize that beneath all the exhausting noise of the attention economy and beneath the endless replicating anxiety spirals in our own heads, there is a bedrock of stillness that was never actually touched by the chaos in the first place.
The system requires all of these forces. The algorithm forces the acceleration. The acceleration brings the liquefying burnout. And the burnout clears the field so that the underlying stillness can finally be recognized.
This has been a genuinely incredible journey through this source material. I mean, we started with an ancient myth about a multiplying demon and ended up with a profound, highly detailed map for surviving the digital age.
It's surprisingly relevant.
It really is. We've looked at this dynamic system that is operating all around you and inside your own mind. Every single time you open your phone, you have Ruptured, the runaway horizontal feedback loop, the replicating noise of the algorithm, and your own anxious thoughts. Then you have Kali, the radical antidote, the inevitable burnout and liquefaction of that noise when it hits terminal velocity. And finally, you have Siva, the silent, untouched consciousness beneath it all.
It's a profound framework because it teaches us that trying to outsmart the chaos with conventional logic is a trap. It only feeds the very chaos you are trying to escape.
Which proves this isn't just ancient mythology. It's a highly practical, modern survival guide for understanding your own attention span in an era of absolute information overload. Which leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, if Kali represents the inevitable, chaotic burnout of our digital culture that eventually forces us to land on the silent bedrock of Siva, could we intentionally cultivate that Shiva consciousness right now?
Oh, that's interesting.
What if the next time you feel the urge to jump into an outrage cycle online, or the next time you're lying awake at 3 a.m. desperately trying to logic your way out of a neurotic thought, you try a radically different approach? What if you don't fight it because you now know that just feeds Rakta Bija?
And you don't wait to be entirely burned out and exhausted by it, invoking Kali.
Exactly. Instead, what if you choose to simply be the unmoving stone? What if you choose to observe the algorithm, whether it is flashing on your screen or spinning in your own head, without feeding it a single drop of your attention? You don't strike it. You don't argue with it. You just watch it. Because as we've learned today, the only way to win a fight with a demon that multiplies every time you hit it is to stop swinging. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that the absolute chaos you see on the news, the institutional collapse, the endless culture wars, that inescapable feeling that the fabric of society is just fracturing, that it isn't a glitch.
Right.
Like, it's not a mistake, it's not a political failure, and it's certainly not an accident. What if it is a highly mechanical, completely inevitable structural purge?
Yeah, that is a rather jarring but incredibly illuminating premise that we are dissecting today.
Yeah.
We are looking at a very timely text titled 8, Pralaya. And it argues that this profound societal dissolution we're all feeling is actually a necessary process.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. What's fascinating here is that the unintegrated shadow of human nature is finally surfacing. And it is systematically dismantling everything in our culture that lacks real substance.
Right. And the mission for this deep dive is to map out that exact process for you. We're going to look at the mechanics of this global disorder, not to wallow in the doom and gloom, obviously, but to actually understand the physics of it.
Exactly.
Because if you've been feeling overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of the cultural breakdown, you really need to know how this mechanism operates.
You have to know the mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out why everything is fracturing right now, we have to look at what was keeping it all together in the first place. For a long time, we operated under this assumption that modern society was just naturally civil.
Right, which is a massive assumption.
Exactly. But this text suggests civility wasn't our default state at all. It was a containment system.
Yes.
Think of society as this massive reservoir, right? It's less like a naturally flowing river and more like a massive industrial pressure cooker where a dam has just been holding back raw, unconstrained human nature for generations. And now someone finally blew the safety valve.
The pressure cooker is the perfect mechanical model for this because underneath the civilized surface of our daily lives, you have what this material calls the tala strata.
The tala strata.
Right. In Sanskrit frameworks, tala refers to the lower subterranean levels of existence. So psychologically speaking, we are talking about the basement of the human psyche.
The really dark stuff.
The darkest.
Yeah.
This is the raw, instinctual, completely unintegrated shadow. It is territorial, it is tribal, highly emotional, and just completely unrefined.
And for generations, we actually managed to keep a very heavy lid tightly secured on that pressure cooker. Like, we kept the tala strata totally out of sight.
We did.
But the text is super specific about what that lid was actually made of. I mean, we didn't just suppress human nature with sheer force, right? We suppressed it with 3 very specific mechanisms.
Yes. Complex institutional narratives, polite social scripts, and material abundance.
Can we break down how those actually function as a containment system? Because it seems like they worked in tandem to suppress that subterranean shadow.
Oh, absolutely. So first, strong institutions provided a unified narrative. They basically told everyone, this is how the world works, this is what is true, and here's your place in it.
Which drastically reduces existential anxiety for people.
Exactly. It keeps people calm. Then second, you have polite social scripts. These are the unspoken rules of engagement that dictate, well, you don't scream at a stranger in a grocery store, even if you are furious.
Even if you really want to.
Right. Even if the urge is there. They enforce a baseline of public frictionlessness.
Like a buffer.
Precisely a buffer. And finally, you have the third mechanism, which is material abundance. Having cheap calories, reliable air conditioning, basic comforts, it keeps the raw survival instincts completely dormant.
So as long as those three mechanisms are intact, the raw, unintegrated shadow of humanity is safely contained behind them.
Exactly. Safely behind the dam.
But here's what I'm trying to reconcile, We have had periods of economic downturn before.
Sure.
And we've had institutions lose the public's trust. I mean, look at the 1970s, for example. What is happening right now that makes this an outright inversion of containment, as the text calls it? Like, why is the scheme not just politely exiting, but literally melting the paint off the ceiling?
Because it wasn't just one mechanism failing this time. It was the simultaneous erosion of all three, compounded by hyperconnectivity.
All at once.
Right. The institutions lost their narrative monopoly, mostly due to the democratization of information on the internet, and then the polite social scripts were exposed as hypocritical.
Or people simply realized there were no real-world consequences for breaking them online.
Exactly, the digital anonymity factor. And on top of that, the promise of endless, expanding material abundance started to fracture for huge swaths of the population.
So the structural integrity of that lid fails entirely.
Right, and when it fails entirely, the pressure doesn't just leak out slowly. The relationship between the container and the contained flips.
The inversion.
The subterranean stuff becomes the surface.
Yes, the unintegrated shadow erupts into the mainstream. So the polite scripts are completely overrun by the raw emotional baseline of the collective unconscious. You are no longer dealing with curated public personas. Wow, you are dealing directly with the talla strata out in the open.
Which brings us to the actual fallout, right? Because if the pressure cooker has exploded and this raw, unintegrated shadow material is just flooding the zone, what happens to the world in its path? What happens to the culture we built?
Well, the text calls this phase the deluge, or the macro-scale pralaya.
Pralaya.
Right. Pralaya translates to a profound dissolution. It is a period of absolute unwinding. But the critical distinction to make here is that this is not a slow, managed decline.
It's not a policy shift.
No, it is not a gradual shifting of policies. It is a kinetic, structural purge. It consumes. But interestingly, it doesn't consume everything equally.
Right, because it specifically targets cultural forms that lack something called karana.
Yes. Karana translates to causal density.
Okay, let's make sure we ground this concept, because causal density is like central to everything happening right now. The text argues that the deluge specifically wipes out things that are purely performative or brittle, right?
Exactly. Because if you think about how much of modern culture is built on abstraction rather than physical reality, it's wild. We have social status tied entirely to digital virtue signaling rather than tangible community service. We have corporate structures built entirely on buzzwords.
Yes, structures with zero causal density.
Right. They're essentially fiat cultural currency. They only work if everyone agrees to pretend they work.
That is a fantastic way to look at it. If a cultural node or relationship or an institution relies on everyone just playing along with a polite fiction to function, it has no karana.
Yeah.
No causal density.
Yeah.
It's like a corporate diversity statement that took a committee 6 months to draft, but the moment there's an actual interpersonal conflict in the office, the whole culture turns toxic anyway.
Because the statement was just paper.
It's purely semantic. It has no physical weight.
So when the floodwaters of raw human emotion and tribal instinct hit that corporate statement, it just completely washes away. It has no anchor.
The pralaya washes away anything that cannot withstand contact with unfiltered human nature. A culture built on performative outrage, polite fictions, and superficial identities instantly collapses when the telestrata erupts, simply because there is no structural core to hold it up.
But wait, if we know what the three ingredients of the containment lid were, institutions, manners, wealth, and we see the flood wiping out everything that lacks causal density, why don't we just build a new lid?
What?
Like, why not mandate stricter internet regulations to enforce polite scripts or create new institutions to just cap the outrage?
Because that fundamentally misunderstands the physics of a kinetic flood. You cannot contain a flood with the same immaterial abstractions that just washed away.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
A new digital policy or a new moderation algorithm is just another polite social script.
Oh.
It still lacks causal density. And furthermore, you cannot legislate shadow integration.
Okay, explain that connection. Why does building a new lid require shadow integration?
Because to actually fix the root cause of the chaos, individuals would have to take direct ownership of their own internal shadow material.
Which is hard.
It is agonizingly difficult work. It requires rigorous self-discipline. It requires you to look at the darkest, most reactive, most tribal parts of yourself and say, I am responsible for that.
Right.
Most people would rather do anything than face their own Telestrata.
So instead of integrating it, we project it.
We project it outward on a massive scale.
Yeah.
The text calls this the proliferation of projection. Because the internal disorder is too painful to integrate, individuals and cultural nodes project that disorder onto external targets.
They blame everyone else.
Exactly. They blame external authorities, historical structures, or, the opposite sex for the chaos they feel inside. It is a defense mechanism to avoid the crushing weight of personal responsibility.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if projection is the natural psychological defense mechanism against facing this shadow material, then the internet has completely changed the game.
Oh, completely.
It's not just a communication tool anymore, is it? It is a hyper-efficient projection machine, which I think explains why the source introduces the Raktabija concept here.
The Raktabija concept is brilliant for diagnosing our current information ecosystem. So in Hindu mythology, Raktabija is a demon with a very specific, highly problematic trait.
Tell us about it.
Every time a drop of his blood hits the ground, it spawns a clone of himself. So if you try to fight him conventionally, by striking him with a sword, you don't kill him. You just create 100 more demons.
You're trying to solve the problem using the exact kinetic energy that feeds the problem.
Precisely. And this describes our self-replicating loop of algorithmic outrage perfectly. This is the exhaustion of the replicating loop. We have built an entire digital infrastructure that monetizes the tala strata.
It literally feeds on raw tribal instinct and projection.
It does. When people see a piece of performative outrage online, their immediate instinct is to strike it down with their own counter-outrage. But doing so just drives engagement. It triggers the algorithm, and it spawns 1,000 more iterations of the same conflict.
It's an engine designed to run purely on anger. You can't just put better oil in it or politely ask it to output constructive dialogue.
Right.
Because it doesn't care about constructive dialogue, it only processes kinetic energy. So if we are trapped in this Raktabija loop, fighting outrage with outrage, it just revs higher and higher.
Until it literally melts its own pistons. The text insists that this self-replicating loop of projection cannot be patched or reasoned with. It can only be exhausted.
It just has to burn itself out.
It has to burn itself out.
And while it's burning out, it's basically taking all those low causal density structures down with it.
It is, and this exhausting process serves a deeply revealing mechanical purpose.
Mm-hmm.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source refers to this as the inevitability of the mirror.
The mirror.
Yes. For decades, we maintained illusions of effortless harmony. We thought we had evolved past the tribal, subterranean shadow. Now, the collective mind is being forced to look directly at what it actually is, unmasked.
So the chaos isn't an anomaly at all.
No. The chaos sweeping through modern discourse, the global disorder, is the truest reflection of our unintegrated internal state being projected outward.
So what does this all mean? We are being forced to look at the engine we built, right? But if this kinetic storm of pralaya is just tearing through everything, like if it's purely destructive, burning its own fuel, melting the algorithmic engine, and washing away all our performative culture, where does it stop?
That is the big question.
Because if the storm has zero architectural capacity, if it can only dismantle and never build, how do we avoid just ending up with a crater?
Well, that is the ultimate question of the text. How does a purely kinetic event conclude? Because you're right, a wave of dissolution cannot construct a new societal framework. Right. It cannot author a new, healthier narrative.
A storm cannot build a house.
Exactly. A storm cannot build a house.
So we absolutely cannot look to the chaos to save us or expect the outrage to suddenly pivot into construction.
Never. A kinetic wave only breaks when it hits something it cannot wash away. Yeah. It has to hit unyielding, sober bedrock.
Right.
And the text defines the mechanics of this limit through the Sivashava principle.
Let's unpack the Sivashava principle because the terminology sounds esoteric, but the mechanism behind it is actually the key to surviving this whole ordeal.
The mechanism is profound. In this philosophical framework, Shiva represents pure, unmoving consciousness. It is absolute, unshakable reality. Shiva, on the other hand, literally translates to a corpse.
A corpse. Okay, why a corpse?
Because a corpse cannot be provoked. It has zero reactivity. The principle here is that dynamic chaotic energy, the storm of the pralaya, the Raktabija loop of outrage, can only run its course until it collides with something completely still, structurally sound, and unresponsive to the chaos.
Wow.
The kinetic energy exhausts itself against unmoving reality.
But in a practical, real-world sense, what is that bedrock? If it's not our institutions because they washed away and it's not a new moderation algorithm, what actually stops the wave? What is the real-world equivalent of Siva in this storm?
The bedrock is the individual.
Just the individual?
Yes, but a highly specific type of individual.
Yeah.
The wave breaks against individuals who have achieved profound internal causal density.
Kara.
They do. They're the individuals who refuse to be swept up into the hysteria of the Raktabija loop.
Right.
Think about what that looks like in practice today. It is the person who unplugs from the hyper-reactive 24-hour news cycle to focus entirely on tangible, hyper-local community building. It is the individual who holds rigid, uncompromising internal boundaries.
So when the algorithmic outrage machine tries to bait them into projecting blame, they just don't strike back.
They remain entirely still. They embody the Siva-Shava principle. They do not react. They do not bleed to spawn more demons, like in the Raktabija story. They do the grueling, quiet work of integrating their own shadow so they don't have to project it onto their neighbors.
They are the brick walls, not the corporate diversity statements or the performative plywood sets. They actually have the mass to withstand the flood.
The macro-scale pralaya isn't the end of the world. It is a necessary stress test. It is the ultimate sorting mechanism.
It strips away all the superficial stuff.
All the superficial projected blame and the brittle cultural forms are gone, leaving only the structural core intact. The individuals who maintain their clarity and discipline through the deluge become the literal foundation for whatever iteration of society comes next.
Man, that completely flips the script on how we view the historical moment we are living through. Let's recap this journey, because we have covered some heavy structural mechanics today for you.
We really have.
We started by looking at society as a pressure cooker, where polite social scripts and material comforts acted as a lid, suppressing the raw, instinctual tala strata of human nature. But that containment inverted. The lid blew off and the shadow erupted into the mainstream, triggering the pralaya-like, a structural purge.
A purge that specifically targets and washes away any cultural form lacking causal density, or karana. Anything performative or hollow is dismantled.
Right. And because shadow integration is too painful for most, the culture defaulted to mass psychological projection, which fed right into the Raktabija dynamic, that self-replicating loop of algorithmic outrage, where fighting the chaos just spawns more clones of it. We built an engine that runs on anger, and we are now watching it rev until it melts its own pistons.
We are experiencing the inevitability of the mirror, watching the kinetic storm burn itself out, knowing it has absolutely no capacity to rebuild.
It will just keep destroying until it hits the bedrock, the Siva-Shava principle. The kinetic energy exhausting itself against the absolute stillness and non-reactivity of the individual who just refuses the hysteria, holds their boundaries, and demands clarity. It's a purge of the superficial, leaving only the real behind.
This raises an important question, and it is something I want to leave you, the listener, with today. If this macro-scale dissolution is truly just a kinetic storm washing away everything that lacks causal density, take a hard look at your own daily life.
Yeah, that's the real test.
Think about your digital habits, your immediate emotional reactions, and how you engage with the world. How much of your personal routine, your worldview, and your daily conversations are built on algorithmic outrage and superficial distraction? And how much of your life is truly anchored in that unyielding, unshakable bedrock?
Are you the plywood or are you the brick wall? That is exactly what we all need to be asking ourselves as the water rises. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, and above all, keep seeking clarity. It is a strange paradox that some of the most profoundly exhausting days we experience are the ones where absolutely nothing physical actually happened.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you can sit in a chair for 8 straight hours, completely safe in a quiet, climate-controlled room. And by dinner time, you feel like you just survived a literal battlefield.
Yeah, your heart is racing, your mind is just depleted.
Right. You are just bone-deep drained. And today's source material takes that exact feeling of invisible burnout and maps out its anatomy.
It's a really incredible text.
It is. We are diving into a dense, genuinely fascinating text that outlines something called the sequence of dissolution and reconstitution. And it fundamentally redefines how we manage our internal energy. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, it sounds highly academic at first glance, I know. But the text is actually a deeply mechanical map of human psychology. It strips away all the mystery of why we get stuck in these draining mental ruts, and it explains the specific mechanics behind, why we exhaust ourselves fighting wars no one else can even see.
Which is something I think everyone listening can relate to. But I want to start by unpacking the macro level of this text first, because before it even gets into our daily psychology, it outlines the structural mechanics of how any system breaks down and rebuilds.
Right, the 4 functional roles.
Exactly. It divides this process into 4 roles, starting with what it calls the stagnation phase. And the text describes this as a state where order becomes purely formal.
It gets entirely divorced from living presence.
Yes, and it hardens into this brittle shell. It stops generating genuine life and just sort of blindly repeats itself.
What's fascinating here is that stagnation is a universal vulnerability. I mean, systems, whether they are societies, corporations, or just individual human psyches, they crave efficiency.
Sure, we want things to run smoothly.
Right, so we build structures, rules, habits that work for a specific moment in time. But eventually, the environment changes, the people change.
Yeah, nothing stays static.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yet because those structures provided safety in the past, we cling to them long after their relevance is expired. So the brittle shell is really just a hollow form of productivity or connection.
That makes total sense when you look at, say, a rigid corporate bureaucracy. You have a company enforcing policies that made sense a decade ago, but now they actively hinder the actual work being done.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Or, more personally, a relationship that is just going through the motions. You're having the same conversations, eating at the same restaurants, but the living spark is totally absent. You are literally just maintaining the architecture of a partnership.
And nature absolutely abhors that kind of stagnation. Psychologically, when you suppress your true feelings to maintain a hollow relationship or a dead-end job, cognitive dissonance begins to build up.
It's like literal pressure accumulating in a sealed pipe.
That's exactly it. The unconscious mind physically cannot contain the contradiction forever. So when that brittle shell can no longer sustain life, the system initiates the second functional role, which is the dynamic surge.
The dynamic surge. The text refers to this as the unrestrained surge of the unconscious acting as a cosmic solvent, which is such a wild phrase.
It's very evocative.
Cosmic solvent implies something that comes in to completely liquefy the pretense. And the text notes that this surge does not negotiate. It just sweeps in and tears down the hollow forms.
Without any hesitation.
Yeah. In the corporate world, this is the sudden, massive restructuring or a market crash. In a relationship, it's that explosive argument where 3 years of unspoken resentments just flood out in 5 minutes.
Which is terrifying when you're in the middle of it.
It is. It's chaotic. And when you are inside it, it feels like a complete failure of your life structure. Which makes me wonder, is this cycle a failure of the system or a necessary feature to clear the underlying material?
The perception of failure is exactly where we misunderstand the mechanism. The text is absolute on this point. The dynamic surge is a feature, not a bug.
Really? A feature?
Yes. It is the underlying intelligence of the system intervening. You simply cannot build a new living structure on top of a hollow foundation.
Because it'll just collapse anyway.
Right. The pressure builds until it triggers a blowout because the pretense has to be cleared away for true grounding to occur. The surge is essentially the demolition crew.
Okay, but if the destruction is actually the manufacturing process for something new, the obvious challenge for you and me is surviving the demolition.
That is the hard part, yes.
And the third and fourth roles detail how to navigate that chaos. The third role is the grounding axis. The text defines this as an unmoving center that does not chase the storm. It refuses to fight fire with more fire. It simply holds its baseline in absolute stillness.
And holding that stillness goes against every single human instinct we have.
Oh, completely.
When the dynamic surge hits, when the relationship blows up or a panic attack sets in, our immediate biological instinct is to scramble.
We want to fix it. We try to frantically tape the brittle shell back together.
Exactly. Or we match the chaos by screaming back at the storm. But fighting the surge only feeds it more kinetic energy. You're just adding fuel to the fire.
Which brings us to the fourth stage, the reunion. This only happens when the surge exhausts itself. The text says the destructive momentum stops when it impacts something genuinely solid that refuses to flinch.
It refuses to replicate the madness.
Right. The dynamic power is absorbed, and it seats itself once again upon pure, immovable awareness. I picture a massive ocean wave crashing into a coastal seawall.
That's a great visual.
The wall doesn't swing at the wave. It doesn't negotiate with the water. It just stands there, and the kinetic fury of the water eventually just dissipates against it.
And there, the macro cycle completes.
Mm-hmm.
The Brill stagnation is shattered by the surge is absorbed by the unmoving axis, and a new reality is established.
It's a huge concept.
It is, but understanding that structural rhythm is vital, because the true brilliance of this source material is how it takes that massive cycle of destruction and applies it to the micro level.
Right, zooming way in.
Yes. It explains how our brains execute this exact same demolition process hundreds of times a day over something as small as a passing thought.
Seeing this happen to a society or a career is one thing, but realizing we manufacture this chaos internally, in our own heads, is really unnerving.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. The text transitions into how a single thought can trigger an exhausting surge in our own minds. It maps this loop of conceptual projection to an ancient mythological figure named Raktabija.
Raktabija is such a fascinating metaphor for this. He is a demon from ancient mythology whose name roughly translates to blood seed.
Blood seed, okay.
According to the legend, every single time a drop of his blood hit the battlefield, it instantly sprout into a fully formed duplicate of himself.
Oh, wow. So you can't even fight him normally.
Exactly. If you strike him with a sword, you don't defeat him, you just multiply your enemies exponentially.
And the text uses that cloning effect to describe what our minds do with reality. It starts by isolating something it calls pure, direct perception. The Sanskrit term it uses is pashanti.
Pashanti, right.
And this is just raw data. You are witnessing exactly what is happening in front of you without adding any narrative or judgment to it at all.
But our brains are rarely content with raw data, are they?
Never.
The conceptual mind, which the text calls vikalpa or madhyama, simply cannot tolerate the vulnerability of neutral perception. It feels this urgent, desperate need to interpret, categorize, and defend against that data.
So what does this all mean for us? The moment the conceptual mind steps in to chop up that direct perception, the text says we commit the spilled seed.
The spilled seed, yes.
We project a narrative onto a neutral event, and just like the demon's blood hitting the floor, that one projected thought instantly clones into 10 more defensive narratives, rationalizations, and anxieties.
Let's look at how this mechanism actually plays out in a normal day. Imagine you send a text message to a friend or a coworker, and they leave you unread.
Oh, the worst feeling.
Right. Direct perception is simply the raw data. I sent a message at 2 p.m. It is now 4 p.m. There is no reply yet.
That is the entirety of the reality. The event is just neutral.
Exactly. But the conceptual mind steps in immediately. You don't just see a lack of a reply. You spill the seed. You project an interpretation.
You think they are ignoring me on purpose.
And boom, the blood hits the floor and the cloning begins. Within seconds, your brain spins out an entire army of narrative.
Oh yeah, you start spiraling. Like, are they mad at me about what I said yesterday? Do they think I'm annoying? I always mess up my friendships. I should just stop reaching out to people entirely.
Suddenly, your heart rate is spiking, your adrenaline is pumping, and you are having a full-blown physiological stress response while sitting alone on your couch.
Over absolutely nothing.
You have triggered a dynamic surge in your own nervous system. You aren't reacting to the reality of the unread text anymore. The phone is just sitting there. You are reacting to the clones your mind manufactured.
Because the conceptual mind's primary function is threat anticipation, right?
Yes. It operates under the flawed assumption that by spinning out every possible negative scenario, every rehearsal of conflict, every defensive justification, it is somehow keeping you safe. It believes it is building armor.
It feels like a deeply misguided survival instinct. The brain actually thinks worrying is productive.
It really does.
But because these threats aren't tangible, they're entirely manufactured thought forms, the mind can never actually resolve them. You can't defeat an imaginary enemy.
No, you can't.
So the brain just keeps generating more clones to fight the previous clones, and you end up shadowboxing in an empty room wondering why you are completely drained.
And the text explicitly addresses this profound drain. It states that we end up exhausted, not from reality itself, but from battling the endless duplicate soldiers our own mind projected onto the room.
Which goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, sitting in a chair all day and feeling like you fought a war.
Exactly. Think about the sheer volume of daily energy you spend rehearsing arguments that will never happen, or defending yourself against judgments that no one actually made. You are fighting phantoms.
So the solution the text offers is a concept called the clean cut, and it involves dropping the conceptual projection entirely.
Yes, stopping the cycle.
The text says that when you refuse to project a narrative, the blood never hits the floor. You remain anchored in direct perception, engaging only with what is physically in front of you, completely free of manufactured clones.
The clean cut is about recognizing the futility of the war. It's stopping the cloning process right at the source.
I mean, it sounds amazing, but I have to push back on how realistic this is to execute.
Fair enough.
As a philosophical concept, dropping the narrative is elegant. But in practice, let's say your boss is actively yelling at you about a mistake you made.
A high-stress situation.
Very high stress. Your heart rate is at 120 beats per minute. You feel incredibly threatened. It feels nearly impossible to just casually decide to stop rationalizing or defending yourself. You can't just turn off your brain's defense systems when you are under fire, can you?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a crucial distinction to make. The clean cut is not about forcefully suppressing your thoughts or aggressively commanding your mind to shut up.
Because that would just be fighting again.
Exactly. If you try to fight your anxiety, you are just swinging another sword at Raktabija. You're fighting fire with fire, which only creates more clones.
So how do you actually do it?
The catalyst for the clean cut isn't forceful suppression. It is the visceral realization of your own exhaustion.
Okay, so it's not a weapon you use against your thoughts.
No, it is a profound withdrawal of participation. When you are standing in front of that angry boss, your conceptual mind is screaming, I'm going to get fired, my career is over, I'm worthless, this isn't fair.
The whole phantom army is charging.
Right. But if you recognize that those thoughts are just phantoms draining your energy, you can consciously choose to take on the role of the grounding axis we discussed earlier.
The unmoving center.
Yes.
Yeah.
You hold your baseline. You return to the raw data. My boss is raising their voice. My chest feels tight. You don't argue with the phantoms. You let the kinetic fury of your own anxiety crash into your unmoving awareness until it runs out of fuel.
You essentially refuse to replicate the madness. You let the surge happen without feeding it the oxygen of a new narrative.
That's the clean cut.
And when you actually achieve that, when you stop bleeding energy into peripheral stories, the text describes a shift into an ultimate state of mind. It says the dualistic split between the observer and the observed collapses.
The separation ends.
Yeah, you stop being a separate, isolated entity judging the world, and you become entirely present. Here's where it gets really interesting. The text calls the state the Vajra Citadel.
The Vajra Citadel is a very potent image, but the text provides a specific caveat to prevent us from misinterpreting it. It warns that the Vajra Citadel is not a fortress built out of stone to hide from the world. Rather, it is the mind returned to its own diamond-like, unfragmented nature.
Which completely flips our normal understanding of safety. Usually when we picture a citadel, we imagine thick stone walls, an uncrossable moat, defensive archers. We think of shutting the dangerous world out.
It's our default idea of protection.
But the text suggests that building heavy psychological walls is just another form of conceptual projection. It's just more Raktabija.
Exactly. Building a wall requires the inherent assumption that there is an enemy out there trying to destroy you.
You're anticipating an attack.
If you are constantly fortifying your ego, anticipating insults, and preparing defenses, you are still actively participating in the war of phantoms. You are still trapped in that defensive loop.
To ground this in reality, let's go back to the scenario with the angry boss. If you are relying on a stone fortress, you're standing there gritting your teeth, internally repeating, I don't care what they think, I'm smarter than them, they don't know what they're talking about.
You're burning energy.
Massive amounts of energy to hold up a shield, but entering the Vajra Citadel looks entirely different. I picture it not as a bunker, but like standing completely exposed in a wide open field during a massive storm.
An exposed field during a storm is a vulnerable place to be unless there is nothing within you that the storm can actually damage.
That is the core of it. The wind is howling, your boss is yelling, But because you have no internal division, because your mind is unfragmented, there is nothing for the anger to latch onto.
Right.
An insult only hurts if some small, fragmented part of you believes it might be true or fears it. If the mind is entirely unified, the insult just passes right through the open field.
Right.
You don't need a perimeter defense because there's no internal conflict for the external storm to exploit.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? How much energy do we waste building these walls? The text summarizes that beautifully by stating, the center holds naturally because there is nothing left inside dividing against itself.
It's so profound.
It shifts the entire paradigm of how we handle stress. We spend our lives exhausted, trying desperately to force the external world to stop threatening us. We try to control other people's perceptions. We over-prepare. We build walls.
But the actual solution is to stop manufacturing the vulnerability internally.
Yes.
We have to stop chopping up direct perception and spilling the seed. If we stop generating the phantom armies in our own heads, the invisible war that drains us every single day just ends.
The exhaustion stops the moment you refuse to supply the battlefield.
Wow. Let's bring all of these mechanics together for a clear roadmap for you listening. The goal of this deep dive was to understand why we burn out without lifting a finger and how to locate a genuinely unmoving center.
Right.
On the macro level, it starts with recognizing the stagnation phase. Acknowledge when a habit, a job, or a relationship has become a brittle shell lacking life. And when the dynamic surge inevitably arrives to tear that shell down, recognize it as the intelligence of the system clearing the ground, not a failure of your life.
And on the micro level, the daily practice is catching your conceptual mind in the exact act of cloning.
Yes, pay attention to the moment of direct perception. When a neutral event occurs, an unread text, a passing comment, a car emerging, let it remain raw data.
Don't spill the seed.
When you feel the urge to project a defensive narrative, recognize that you are about to spill the blood that creates the phantom army. Choose the clean cut instead. Stop the internal division, drop the narrative, and allow your center to hold naturally in that wide open space of the Vajra citadel.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, returning to the specific imagery the text uses for the Vajra citadel.
Please do.
It repeatedly refers to this state as having a diamond-like nature. Now, we tend to think of diamonds simply as beautiful, indestructible objects. But consider the literal physical reality of how a diamond is forged in the natural world.
That takes a lot of time.
Time, yes, but
Yeah.
more importantly, it does not start out clear and unbreakable. A diamond is simply carbon that has been subjected to unimaginable crushing pressure and extreme heat deep within the Earth's crust.
The pressure is the only thing that creates the clarity.
Precisely. The carbon has to be compressed so intensely that all of its structural weaknesses are squeezed out, unifying it into a single, unfragmented matrix.
Wow.
If the Vajra citadel is truly a diamond-like mind, then we have to look differently at the terrifying, destructive momentum of the dynamic surge we discussed earlier.
Because it's not just demolition.
Exactly. Perhaps the chaos, the pressure, and the burnout aren't just clearing away hollow forms. Perhaps that intense psychological friction is the exact necessary pressure required to forge an indestructible, unfragmented mind in the first place.
We need the pressure.
You don't get the diamond without surviving the crushing weight. You don't achieve the citadel without standing in the storm.
So, the next time you find yourself sitting in that chair at the end of a seemingly quiet day, feeling the profound exhaustion of an invisible war, remember the mechanics of what is actually happening.
You don't need to keep swinging your sword at the phantoms.
Exactly. Let the pressure forge the diamond. Drop the narrative, make the clean cut, and let your center hold.